Breach it! Breach it! Get on the ground!
2 investigations from the case files of Lieutenant Joe Kenda. First, a young couple's date night ends in tragedy.
His chest is covered in blood.
He did not deserve to die.
As detectives delve into his past,
Can't sell dope in front of a damn school.
a crucial clue sets off a manhunt.
They look like what they are. Death on a high horse.
Then,
Robert!
a blood-soaked crime scene inside a shopping mall leaves investigators baffled.
Was he hit? Was he struck? Is there a gunshot wound?
It looked like this guy had been murdered by Jack the Ripper. Bad choices lead to tragic results. You have to be held accountable for what you do, and the police are going to collect that accountability.
It's just after 2 a.m., and 29-year-old Deanne Parker is exhausted after working the late shift.
She's just about to fall asleep when she's jolted awake by the sounds of arguing just outside her bedroom window.
But then she heard some gunshots. She gets out of bed and she looks out her window and she sees a woman screaming for help.
Listen, somebody might be in trouble. There's a girl yelling down the street screaming, "Get here, quick, hurry, please."
I was coming home around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I parked the car, and I walked up to the front door of the house.
4 Paul 1, dispatch to 4 Paul 1.
And I was about to stick my key in the lock.
Go for 4.
It doesn't matter what time it is. Crime doesn't have a clock or a wristwatch.
10-4, I'm on the way.
Emotion drives it, not the time of day or night.
25 minutes later, Kenda pulls up to a cordoned-off street in the center of the city.
Morning, Wilson. Grimes. Morning. So I understand there's been a shooting. What do we got?
We've got a 25-year-old black male victim. We've identified him as Julius Nelson. We've got a couple of witnesses say he goes by a street name of Ricky.
Okay, has the body been transported?
No, not yet. We're still waiting on the coroner. He's still in the car.
You said there's eyewitnesses?
There are. We've got one male that's an acquaintance or friend of the victim, and a female, Kathy Needler. She's the victim's girlfriend.
We're advised that the girlfriend was very distraught, so they escorted her from the scene to the police station to be interviewed later.
Okay, hold on to the male witness until we take a look at the body.
Yes, sir.
So I walk up to this car, and sitting behind the wheel, slumped over in the seat to his right, is Ricky Nelson. His chest is covered in blood.
Did you see the tire iron? Yep.
4 tires inflated on this car. He has no reason to have this tire iron in or near him. It may mean nothing at all, but it's interesting that it's there.
Got a bunch of casings over here.
There's 8 shell casings found at the scene. The shell casings are small caliber .22. Also, we noticed that the victim's vehicle has some damage to include 7 bullet holes.
This generally happens in the case of an unqualified shooter, somebody that really doesn't know how to use the gun, just pulls the trigger until it stops going bang, and points this in the direction of the victim.
With the eyewitness? Yes, sir.
So we've looked at this crime scene, and now the patrol officers have a witness present in the back of a patrol car whose name is Walter Walker.
Step out of the vehicle, please. Have a seat.
We go way back.
He goes by the street name of Scappy. He tells us that they've known each other since they were children, and it's clear to us that he's very upset over the loss of Ricky.
So what went on here tonight?
Man, I don't know. We was driving around and I got out the car to pee, and these two dudes showed up.
He says two males approach him and they talk. He doesn't say about what. And they're in some blue car, and all of a sudden it goes way south and everything goes down.
I don't know. It just got out of control real fast. Those boys were crazy.
He gives us a physical description, which is relatively vague.
Here's the thing, Mr. Walker. You want us to find who killed your friend? We're gonna need some more information.
I told you it was a blue car, right?
Listen, we know you're not telling us everything. I got a pretty good idea why.
This particular murder occurred in front of a house that has a history with the police department. It's known to be a crack house.
All right, you're free to go. But I want you to think about everything that happened here tonight. And if you can remember any names or details, give me a call.
Yes, sir. You got it.
Scappy is not chargeable with an offense. It's not against the law to drive around at 2 o'clock in the morning. He is a witness. Nothing more, nothing less.
That's unlikely. Why don't we pay a visit to the house next door?
The crack house? Hard to get a warrant this time of night.
Now, we don't need a warrant to knock on the door and ask a few questions.
True. Worth a shot.
We don't know exactly why those shots were fired, so all options are on the table.
Yeah, dude. Rhymes. What's cracking, fellas?
How's life, Smitty?
What are y'all doing out here? I ain't done nothing wrong.
We recognize the individual. We recognize him from prior drug raids, and that can be to our advantage. If they know we're not after them, they'll share information.
We're investigating a shooting. You know anything about that?
I heard some gunshots.
That's it? Come on, Smitty. It's getting late. We don't have time to play games.
He kind of shrugs his shoulders. Well, I heard somebody was honking their horn really incessantly, and there was a disturbance and a bunch of yelling.
Seen this blue car. Damn well what they was up to.
And what was that?
They was selling dope, duh. I heard them get off my street and go sell somewhere else. I told them people here, only be buying from me.
The response back, according to Smitty, well, they're gonna mess him up.
I ain't trying to get into it with him, though, so I went back in the house.
Nobody wants to talk to the police, and the way to avoid that is not see anything and not get involved.
Did you get a look at anybody inside the car?
Nah.
Did you get a license plate?
Sorry, detectives. I ain't got nothing for you.
All right, Smitty. When you feel like talking, you know where to find us.
Whatever.
So despite our efforts at this point, we still don't know what happened. But Ricky has a family that lives in this same neighborhood. We have to inform them anyway of the loss of Ricky, and it's an opportunity to see what they may know.
We're very sorry for your loss.
I was always afraid something like this would happen.
Ricky's father knows where Ricky's been most of his life. Ricky runs with some bad people, he said.
He did some time a few months back for robbery. But lately he said he was trying to stay on the right side of the law.
Did he have a drug problem?
I don't know. And I don't want to know.
That's a common attitude in some parents. Stick your head in the sand and it all goes away.
Can you think of anyone that might have wanted to harm him?
All I can think of was
Los Angeles?
Yeah. Them LA gangbangers has been hanging around town lately.
This was the time when we were seeing a lot of gangbangers from outside of the area coming into Colorado Springs.
Ricky had several run-ins with them people. About a month ago, not long after he got out of prison, there was a couple of them parked up by the elementary school down the street.
What's up, brother? Yeah, I got something what you need.
He explains that Ricky sees there's this dark blue car, and Ricky gets upset. It's not right to be selling drugs around these kids.
Hey, yo, y'all need to move on up out of here.
What you say, fool?
You heard me, man. You can't sell dope in front of a damn school.
And so Ricky went up and confronted these guys. They didn't take that very well.
He got out of the car and jumped. Beat him up pretty badly.
What we now know is the blue car seems to be legitimately involved in this.
You need to talk to his girlfriend, Kathy, about it.
She was there when he got shot. Does she know the LA boys in the blue car?
Thank you. We'll let ourselves out.
Does she know somebody's name? It's time to find out. We're trying to determine who gunned down Ricky Nelson. We've had information about run-ins with a couple guys in a blue car. Now we're hopeful that his girlfriend can shed some real light on this.
Go and have a seat.
Thank you.
Ricky's girlfriend was at the scene at the time of the shooting. She's had time to calm down. We interview her at the police station.
I know how hard this must be for you.
It still feels like a bad dream.
We had a connection on every level, and I knew that he was the guy for me for the rest of my life.
It all started when we saw Scappy on the side of the road.
Ricky and I had just come from the movies, and we were in the car driving.
Hey, yo, Scappy. What's good, man?
Ricky? Hey, man, can you give me a ride?
Yeah, sure, hop in.
So Scappy got in the backseat, and Ricky drove over to this one particular house.
Man, you looking to cop some crack?
Look, I'll be quick. I appreciate this, man.
Just hurry up.
Yeah.
It'll be all right, okay?
He convinces Ricky to take him to Smitty's house where he's going to buy or try to buy a $20 rock of crack cocaine.
Oh,
What?
It's those fools from LA again.
And so what does Scappy do? He walks up to this car and starts talking to these guys.
Come on, Scappy.
Kathy explains to us that she doesn't really have a clear view of what's going on. She then hears a disturbance.
Damn it. I'll be right back.
No, Ricky, no, baby. Come on, please stay out of it.
And Ricky got out of the car to go break up a fight.
I couldn't quite tell what was being said, but I could detect the animosity and the anger in it. Next thing I know, I heard a gunshot.
Oh my God, are you shot? Are you shot?
Ricky came and got back in the car, and he leaned over, he held my hand, and he said, "Just hold me."
Please! Please someone help me! My boyfriend's in shot! Please someone help! Please!
Ricky did not deserve to die.
Can you tell us anything about the guys in the blue car?
Have you guys talked to Scappy yet? I mean, I think he knew them. He said their names were Wade and Albert.
No. Scappy didn't mention any names.
All right, again, thank you for talking to us. We're very sorry about your boyfriend.
Thank you.
So now we have a huge step forward. Now we know it's Wade and Albert in a blue car.
Albert? I wonder if that's Albert Meadows.
He got arrested near Smitty's house 2 months ago in another shooting.
You know what? Let me pull his file. I'll be right back.
He pulls a photograph of Albert Meadows.
Here's the guy Albert was with. His name's Wade Douglas.
So Albert was and Wade Douglas. Now we're hitting on all 8 cylinders.
Our next step in this investigation is to interview Scappy. We know that Scappy is not very forthcoming with what he did know.
Do you mind giving us the whole story this time?
Yeah, of course. You know me.
She says Ricky gave him a ride. He wanted to go somewhere, wouldn't say where that was.
So we pulled up to a house, and down the street, we see a blue car that belonged to these two boys Ricky has beef with. So I went over to talk to him to see if I can get it sorted out. But then one of the boys take a swing at me.
He says he was drunk. He can't really defend himself that well. But Ricky got a tire iron out of the trunk and ran over to break up the fight.
Next thing I know, one of them starts firing shots, and Ricky got hit.
Do you think you could identify the two guys in the blue car?
I don't know, maybe.
Recognize anybody from the blue car?
We show Scappy these two photo lineups.
Him. The boy right there?
He immediately picks Albert Meadows. Said, that's the guy I got in a fight with.
But he ain't the dude that shot Ricky. It was the other one.
Okay.
He spends a great deal of time looking at the photograph of Wade Douglas.
Nah, I don't recognize nobody.
Okay, so what's he doing? He's giving us enough to complicate things, not enough to be specific, not enough to be truly useful.
Okay, Mr. Walker. Fair enough. You're free to go.
Be safe. We don't want those guys finding you.
What you mean?
When you say, we have no reason to arrest anybody yet, you won't provide us with one. So they're out there probably waiting for you to walk out of this building. So you have a nice evening, Scappy.
Wait, let me see those photos again.
He decides that maybe I'm right. This time he takes the second photo lineup back from us, points at Wade Douglas.
The guy right there, he's the one who shot Ricky.
Okay. Thanks for your help.
The next step in our investigation now is to find Albert and Wade. The records list an address for each individual. When we go, we find out that they're no longer there.
So where are they now? Well, who knows where they are.
But it doesn't take long for detectives to catch a break.
The officers that work that particular area, they are aware of active warrants for murder for these guys, and they also are aware.
A blue Cadillac approaching the target house, California tag.
They're aware of a blue car being involved.
Driver's getting out, black male, braids, dark shirt, walking towards target house.
And he's able to see an individual that matches Albert's description entering Smitty's crack house.
Albert has surfaced. We have a chance to arrest him, so we call Tactical Enforcement Unit. We can kick in the front door if we have to. But we're going to get in that house. We have progressed in this investigation from two unknown guys in a blue car to Albert Meadows and Wade Douglas as being the people responsible for the death of Ricky Nelson. We believe we know the location of Albert Meadows, who's thought to be in the known crack house in the neighborhood where Ricky was killed.
The tactical enforcement team, our SWAT team, will execute the search warrant.
Let's get him.
It's in less than 10 seconds. They look like what they are. Death on a high horse.
Colorado Springs Police Department, open up!
They roll up there. Nobody opens the door. They take the door off the hinges.
Breach it, breach it! Get on the ground! Get on the ground! Get on the ground! Get down, get down, get down, get down! Get down! Let me see your hands! Let me see your hands! Let me see your hands!
Smitty's crack house. Looks like a war zone.
Get on the ground! Now! Get on the ground!
Take it easy, man.
All of you, down, now! Stay where you are.
There's always narcotics in plain view in crack houses. There's no time to flush everything down a toilet.
Hands over your head, stay put.
So the people present in that building, including Albert Meadows, get arrested.
Stand up.
Meadows for murder.
Give me the right hand.
The other three for possession with intent to dispense controlled substance.
Detective Kendall. Hey, this guy, he claims to know where the suspect is.
right, thank you.
We get word from these people in this crack house, because they are more than willing to tell us anything to avoid going to jail, that they know that Wade Douglas has fled.
We share with the St. Louis Police Department that we have an active arrest warrant for an individual and ask them to check his parents' residence.
They go out and arrest Wade Douglas and place him in custody in their jail. He waived extradition, and he agreed to be extradited back to Colorado.
Later that week, detectives sit Wade Douglas down for some answers.
I'm telling you, it was all self-defense. Those guys were going to kill me.
Okay, Wade. We want to hear your side of the story. Why don't you tell us what happened?
All right. So we was parked up there by that crack house.
Yeah, I know that fool. What's his name? Scrappy?
No, Scrappy or whatever.
Yeah, Scrappy, man. Hey, yo, what's up?
Wade Douglas says he and his friend Albert Meadows were parked on the street when a person he knows as Scappy knocked on their window and wanted to buy crack cocaine.
You guys got in there robbed. Get in.
He gets in the back seat and he tries to negotiate a price. He wants a discount for the crack.
No, me? We cool. How about you give me a friends and family discount?
Hey, tripping.
Hey, bro. Pay up and get out.
It's getting a little heated because you keep telling him we're not going to discount anything. You got to pay the price.
Who the hell you with, man? Hey, you know him. It's my boy. Come on. Give it to me for a 20 spot.
We're sitting there arguing. And then this guy Smitty comes out. And he's hollering at us.
Hey, I gotta set up shop somewhere else. You can't be parking out here.
Get out of here, man.
Come on, get the hell out of here, bitch.
Go off, Grandpa, before you really regret coming out here.
We tell him to leave us alone. But then Scappy went and did something stupid.
You know what? If you guys ain't gonna sell it to me, I'll just go and buy it from them old man.
Wade says that Albert Meadows got out of the car.
Really don't sell dope in this neighborhood. Only we sell dope in this neighborhood.
Come on, man.
And he punches Scappy in the mouth, and a fight gets underway.
So what I tell you, fool, you much.
No, Ricky, no, come on, stay out of it, baby.
Ricky's pissed. He's been assaulted by these guys twice now, and maybe it's time for some payback. So he goes to the trunk of his car, gets a tire iron, and goes to break up the fight.
Ricky is now armed with a deadly weapon. As he approaches this group, no one's fighting with Ricky. They're fighting with Scappy, and Ricky escalates it by introducing a weapon.
You want some too?
Once the fight broke up, Ricky then walked towards Wade, saying, "Now it's your turn."
Wade Douglas then said he got out of the car and emptied the gun at Ricky.
Hey, get up, bro. Come on, get up.
Ricky, oh my God. Oh my God, are you shot?
Just over.
Ricky then returned back to his car, touches his chest, sees the blood, and he dies.
Please someone help me, my boyfriend's a shot.
Always remember two things. First, to always take care of yourself. And the second is that I love you very much. Ricky's hand went like this, and he was gone.
I had to protect myself. I swear I didn't have any choice, man.
Wade Douglas admits that he shot Ricky Nelson, and he said he did so because Mr. Nelson was armed with a tire iron and was advancing toward him aggressively, and he shot him as a result.
No, that's not up to us. That's up to the prosecutors. Go ahead and cuff him.
Come on, man. What are you talking about? Stand up. This ain't right. This ain't right, man.
Wade was initially charged with second-degree murder. During the trial, he was subsequently acquitted by the jury, who felt that he clearly had the right to protect himself and that Ricky was a threat with a tire iron. Albert, even though initially involved in the fight, he was not involved directly in the shooting. He was not charged with any wrongdoing.
He really was the love of my life. I'd be happily married now if he wasn't. I live with the memory of what was and the reality of what will never be.
Ricky Nelson was certainly not a priest. Did he deserve to die? No one should be killed because of poor choices they make.
Coming up, a blood-soaked crime scene leads to more questions than answers.
This, by no means, is a typical homicide case.
Hey man, what are you doing?
And it took some effort to discover the truth.
It's a typical Saturday morning. 16-year-old Jessica Barnes is on her way to work at the Chapel Hills Mall.
Hey, good morning, Ed.
Nice to see you, Jessica.
You too.
And when she gets to the shoe store that she works in,
Hey, Robert. Are you in there?
the chainmail is still down in front of it. She's expecting that the store manager is there.
That's weird.
So she's wondering, why hasn't he opened the door up yet?
Robert, I'm here.
So she takes her store keys and goes around to the back of the store to unlock the door. When Jessica goes inside,
Robert, where are you?
she sees her manager's bag sitting there and she thinks, well, maybe he is here. He just hasn't turned the lights on yet.
Robert? Robert!
As she's calling out for her manager, she all of a sudden slips on something on the floor.
Ew, what? Robert! Oh my God!
It is her manager lying face down on the floor, and he's the one who's bleeding.
A short time later, Kenda and his team arrive on the scene.
When I first arrived, there were several uniformed officers, a mall security guy, and a young detective named Tanner.
I don't think I've ever seen so much blood.
Really? That's what we got?
Single victim, deceased, 34-year-old Robert Kelly. He's the manager of a shoe store. 16-year-old kid who works for him found his body.
It is his custom to open the store for business every morning at 10. So the question now is, what has interrupted him from this routine?
Is man or death?
Still unclear. No weapons or casings nearby. A coroner's on the way, though, so hopefully we'll know soon. You want to have a look inside in the meantime?
Yeah, let's see what we're dealing with. Wow, you weren't kidding about the blood.
It's just incredible. It looked like this guy had been murdered by Jack the Ripper.
Glad I didn't wear my new shoes today.
I ruined a pair of shoes in the course of being in this place. There's no other way to get close to him but to step in blood.
It looks like the slope of the floor caused the blood to pool that way.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Malls are built with a slight downward cant to the floor. The reason is, if their sprinkler system goes off, the building won't flood. This guy is allowed the contents of his body to empty onto this floor.
Looks like he's been dead for a while.
By the look of the blood, I'd say a good 8 to 12 hours probably.
If blood is fresh in color, it is a crimson red. Over time, it turns black, and we have almost reached black. So we're wondering what happened to him
This would be odd happening at Chapel Hills Mall. People would be shocked and surprised.
Well, they've got cameras.
All right, let's get someone to pull the tapes.
I'm on it.
Cameras at that time in the 90s, they used videotape because everybody's concerned about the dollar when it comes to business. They use, reuse, and abuse tapes. The fact that it's there doesn't mean it's going to be useful.
It's hard to tell with all the blood, but I didn't see any wounds on him.
Yeah, I don't either. Let's wait till the coroner gets here. We can roll him over, take a closer look.
The blood can actually cover up all sorts of other injuries. So I would be concerned that there's a gunshot wound, that there's a stab wound, potentially in the neck or upper chest.
But before the coroner arrives, Kenda catches sight of a notable clue.
When a body dies standing erect, your feet will cross over each other. It's called a dead man's fall. He was dead standing up and fell literally dead.
He's missing cash, merchandise.
First thing I did when I got here was check the register. It's filled with cash.
So the likely explanation is it's not a robbery.
And there you go, sir. Thank you. You have a great rest of your day.
But what if our man has an enemy who gets in the shoe store, and when the manager's distracted, he walks around the corner and goes in the back? What if he's lying in wait in the darkness in this office when the manager turned out the lights?
Hey, man, what are you doing?
The enemy takes his revenge. Now that works better for me than robbery.
Is the kid that found him still here?
Yeah, patrol's holding on to her.
Good. Let's talk to her, see if she can shed any light on any of this.
The first step in any homicide investigation is who is the victim? What do they do? Where do they go? The victimology is critical.
Jessica, I know what a terrible shock this is and how hard it must be for you. But do you think you could answer a few questions for us?
I don't know.
16 years old. She's never seen anything like this. She's never been to a funeral. And now she sees this level of violence. It's very, very distressing to her.
What do you guys want to know?
What can you tell us about Robert? Was he a good boss?
Yeah, I mean, I only work here once a week, but I can't imagine why anyone would want to do this. Robert was a sweetheart.
She describes Robert as kind of this teddy bear guy. He's a big guy, over 6 feet tall, over 200 pounds, but he's very gentle.
You ever see him argue with a customer or maybe another employee?
No, I mean, he just kept to himself.
She said he's very dedicated, but sometimes he'll just go in the back for a while. But it's not my place to question him. He's the manager.
Detective Kenda, sorry to interrupt, but Jessica's mother's here.
Okay, I think we got enough for now. Thanks for your help, Jessica.
Okay.
I'll walk her out and let her mom know what's going on.
One other thing, we checked the security cameras. They're not working. They're not even hooked up.
Figures.
The cameras, they're there for show. You find that in a lot of places where they don't want to invest in something that might solve a crime.
On the plus side, the coroner's here.
All right, thank you.
We now have an opportunity to view the front of this body to find out what it is that killed this guy. We're going to see wounds. We're going to...
Hey, Doc.
Hey, Lieutenant. Just judging from the blood color and the temperature in this room, I think he's been dead up to 12 hours.
What about the cause of death?
I don't see anything yet. Still need to roll him, though. He's kind of a big fella. You mind giving me a hand?
My thought was the shoes are already ruined, so why not? There is a meaning to dead weight, so it's very hard to turn him, but we do it.
1, 2, 3.
When we turn him, his face is crushed, and it is a brilliant shade of royal purple. He's not a handsome person at this moment. There's a couple of young officers, and there's an intake of breath when they see his face, because they probably haven't seen that before.
Wow.
The face is obviously a source of blood. There's got to be more to this than just the face. I'm kind of looking around.
Well, that explains a few things.
And I see something I didn't expect to see. We're investigating the death of 34-year-old Robert Kelly, the manager of a shoe store in the Chapel Hills Mall. We have turned him over, and we are getting into the
Yeah, I didn't see that coming.
When we roll him over, what I see lodged in his arm is a hypodermic needle in a vein, and it's plunged, meaning that it's been used. Whatever liquid was contained within it is now inside this body.
He's got track marks all over him.
There's needle tracks on his arm. He's a user. Nobody killed him. He killed him.
Go find Detective Tanner and search the premises for any signs of drug paraphernalia.
Yes, sir.
You see any other wounds besides his face?
Well, I need to get him back to the morgue and do an exam, but I don't see anything. I think he was standing, overdosed, and fell over.
It's not that uncommon for us to see injuries from what we call a terminal collapse. They fall and can have skull fractures, which can cause bleeding.
This is a 250-pound man falling at 32 feet per second. When you strike a floor like that, with that kind of weight behind you, your face is going to shatter like an egg, and his did.
Hey, Joe, we got something in the back office.
A charred spoon, a lighter, some white powder.
Seems pretty clear it's cocaine he was injecting.
Think back to what Miss Barnes had to say. He disappears for a while in the back. Then he comes out again.
I think Robert probably had a very serious addiction given the fact that he's using it at work.
Wonder if his family knows he had this kind of addiction.
I mean, we'll find out. One of our guys tracked down his mother's address. She doesn't know about his drug habit. She's about to.
349, correct.
We go to see his mother. We have to tell her that Robert's not coming home anymore. She has a horrible reaction. Your children are supposed to bury you,
Please tell me you're joking.
not the other way around.
I'm very sorry.
My baby. Baby's gone.
It is a hole in your heart that will never heal, no matter what the reason.
I never saw him taking drugs of any kind.
It's very common in users. They conceal their use from their family. Their greatest fear is to be discovered.
Had you noticed any change in him?
Well, he used to always talk about starting his own business, but a few years ago,
She explains, when the girlfriend left him, he became depressed and his ambitions seemed to go away.
if I'd known he was taking drugs, I would have done something. I would have gotten him some help.
Robert's mother, poor thing. I mean, you'd feel kind of guilty in a way. It's like, why, as a mother, didn't I see that in my son? So it would make that death just even more difficult to handle.
A few days later, the coroner confirms the cause of death.
He had a massive amount of cocaine in his system, which led to cardiac arrhythmia. So essentially, he had a major heart attack.
Thanks, Doc. I appreciate it.
Be safe.
The heart locks up like a closed fist. It is in full-blown spasm. It's not working, and thus neither are you. We can conclude that the likely scenario is that Robert Kelly is conducting business as usual. And when the business closes, he drops the chainmail gate over the front of the store, goes into the office, organizes his paperwork, and conducts his nightly routine of using narcotics.
The fact that he had been using drugs so much that it probably never even crossed his mind that something so severe could happen to him.
He can stand there for a minute, and then it lights out, and he hits that floor like a ton of bricks.
There are crimes that shock a city. There are crimes that leave detectives awake long after sunrise, replaying every photograph and every witness statement in their minds. And then there are the cases that force an even more unsettling question. What happens when the warning signs are visible almost from the very beginning, when teachers notice them, neighbors whisper about them, psychiatrists write them down in reports, and yet, somehow, the tragedy still unfolds exactly as feared? In the spring of 1975, London was a city of movement. Double-decker buses rolled through narrow streets polished by weeks of rain. Shopkeepers swept yesterday's dust from their doorways before lifting their shutters. Elderly residents greeted familiar faces from behind lace curtains, believing routine itself was a kind of protection. Morning newspapers carried stories of politics, strikes, and economic uncertainty. Life continued with its usual rhythm, each day blending quietly into the next. Hidden beneath that rhythm was a fear no one could yet define. It did not begin with a dramatic chase through crowded streets. It did not begin with flashing blue lights or screaming headlines. It began behind ordinary front doors, inside modest homes occupied by people whose greatest comfort came from predictable routines. They lived alone, watered their gardens, attended church, made tea in chipped porcelain cups, and trusted strangers more than today's generation could imagine. Their neighborhoods had been built on familiarity. A knock at the door usually meant a friend, a neighbor, a delivery, or someone asking for a small favor. That trust would become a weapon. Across West London, rumors slowly drifted from one conversation to another. An elderly woman had been found dead. Another attack followed months later. Then another. At first, the incidents appeared disconnected. Different neighborhoods. Different victims. Different circumstances. The police had fragments, but fragments rarely tell a complete story. What no one knew was that somewhere in the city, a young man walked those same streets carrying something far more dangerous than any knife or blunt object. He carried years of violence that had never truly been interrupted. Rage that had never been understood. Warnings that had been filed away, discussed, acknowledged, and ultimately left unanswered. Long before detectives learned his name, professionals had already written it into reports. Long before newspapers printed his photograph, specialists had expressed fears about what he might one day become. Long before families mourned loved ones, someone had looked at a troubled teenager and wondered whether society was watching the birth of a future killer. History would later remember those warnings with uncomfortable clarity. Patrick David Mackay was not a criminal who emerged from nowhere. His story did not begin with murder. It began years earlier, in places where adults believed they still had time to change a child's future. Homes, schools, psychiatric evaluations, juvenile institutions. Every stage seemed to offer another opportunity for intervention. Every stage ended with another chance slipping away. Looking backward, the pattern almost feels impossible to miss. Looking forward, almost no one imagined where it would lead. When investigators eventually pieced together Mackay's life, they found something deeply unsettling. Violence was not an unexpected twist in his story. It was a thread woven through nearly every chapter. The details differed. The victims changed. The consequences escalated. But the warning signs remained remarkably consistent. People remembered the anger. They remembered the cruelty. They remembered incidents that seemed disturbing at the time but were dismissed as childhood misbehavior or adolescent rebellion. Only later did those memories transform into pieces of a much darker picture. The public often imagines serial murder as something mysterious, almost impossible to foresee. A monster appears from the shadows without explanation, leaving investigators scrambling to understand the unimaginable. Reality is often less dramatic and far more disturbing. Sometimes the shadows are visible long before anyone recognizes what they contain. Patrick Mackay would eventually become one of Britain's most controversial killers, not only because of the crimes for which he was convicted, but because of the many deaths he later claimed responsibility for. Officially, the justice system established responsibility for only a small number of killings. Unofficially, questions have lingered for decades. Some investigators believed there were more victims. Others remained skeptical of his confessions, aware that false or exaggerated admissions are not uncommon among violent offenders seeking attention or control. Between proven fact and unresolved suspicion lies a space that has never been fully closed. That uncertainty continues to haunt the case. Every unsolved death carrying similarities invites the same uneasy thought. Could it have been him? It is a question that has survived half a century without a definitive answer. Yet before examining unanswered mysteries, it is important to understand the victims whose lives were forever interrupted. They were not statistics waiting to fill the pages of a criminal file. They were people with routines, friendships, memories, and futures they expected to wake up to the next morning. Each possessed a lifetime of ordinary moments that rarely appear in newspaper headlines because ordinary lives seldom attract public attention until tragedy forces them into it. The victims trusted. They opened doors. They believed kindness carried little risk. Their confidence reflected the values of an older generation shaped by war, hardship, and close-knit communities. Many had spent decades believing that offering a glass of water, exchanging polite conversation, or helping a stranger represented simple decency rather than danger. That belief would prove fatal. Investigators would later discover that Mackay understood something fundamental about human nature. Violence alone was not enough to reach his victims. Access came first. Access required trust. And trust was often easier to obtain than forcing entry. No elaborate disguise. No complicated deception. Only a convincing appearance of harmlessness. The simplicity of that method remains one of the most chilling aspects of the case because it reminds us how easily everyday courtesy can be exploited by someone willing to abandon every moral boundary. As the investigation unfolded, detectives found themselves confronting more than a series of murders. They were confronting the possibility that multiple institutions had observed danger years before the killings. Medical professionals had expressed concern. Authorities had documented troubling behavior. Encounters with law enforcement accumulated. Opportunities for meaningful intervention appeared again and again. Still, the violence escalated. For the families left behind, those missed opportunities became impossible to ignore. Every report, every warning, every release back into society invited painful questions that could never truly be answered. Would different decisions have saved lives? Could earlier treatment have changed anything? Was the outcome inevitable, or was it the result of failures that accumulated over years? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in 1975. Modern criminology has advanced considerably since Mackay's crimes. Researchers now recognize that childhood aggression, cruelty toward animals, persistent violence, and repeated antisocial behavior deserve careful assessment, though none of these factors alone can predict that someone will become a murderer. Most individuals displaying behavioral problems do not go on to commit extreme acts of violence. Cases like Mackay's are extraordinarily rare. Yet his history continues to be studied because it illustrates the complexity of balancing treatment, public safety, and individual rights. This story is not about claiming simple answers where none exist. It is about examining what happened when numerous warning signs intersected with institutional limitations, personal choices, addiction, untreated or inadequately managed mental health problems, and escalating criminal behavior. The result was a trail of loss that stretched far beyond court records. Behind every police photograph was a family forced to identify someone they loved. Behind every forensic report was a home that would never again feel ordinary. Behind every newspaper headline stood investigators carrying memories they would never entirely leave behind. And at the center of it all stood Patrick David Mackay, a man whose name would become inseparable from one of Britain's most troubling debates. Was he simply a ruthless predator who manipulated every system he encountered? Was he a profoundly disturbed individual whose escalating violence reflected failures in mental health care as much as personal responsibility? Or was the truth buried somewhere between those extremes, resisting every attempt to fit neatly into a single explanation? Those questions would dominate courtrooms, psychiatric assessments, newspaper columns, and parole hearings for decades. Even today, they remain unresolved. Because this case is not remembered solely for the number of lives that were taken. It is remembered because so many people believe the tragedy announced itself years before the first confirmed murder. And yet, somehow, no one managed to stop it. The strangest thing about evil is that it rarely announces itself with certainty. It arrives in fragments. A complaint dismissed as youthful aggression. A violent outburst explained away as another troubled day. A psychiatric report filed into a cabinet. A prison release signed with cautious optimism. None of these moments, standing alone, seems destined to become history. But when they are placed side by side years later, they form a pattern so stark that it almost feels impossible to believe it once went unnoticed. London in the mid-1970s was learning to live with uncertainty. Economic hardship weighed heavily across Britain. Inflation was rising, labor strikes disrupted everyday routines, and neighborhoods that had once felt permanently familiar were slowly changing. Yet amid those broader social pressures, there remained countless quiet streets where older residents continued to live much as they always had. Their mornings began with tea and newspapers. Afternoons were measured by church bells, grocery deliveries, or conversations over garden fences. Evenings ended with doors locked but curtains still left slightly open, a silent gesture that reflected a generation raised to believe that neighbors looked after one another. For many elderly Londoners, loneliness had become an accepted companion. Children had grown up and moved away. Spouses had passed on. Friends became fewer with every passing year. Small acts of kindness carried enormous meaning. A conversation on the doorstep could brighten an otherwise silent day. A stranger asking politely for a glass of water or directions did not immediately trigger suspicion. Courtesy was not merely etiquette, it was part of their identity. That ordinary kindness would become one of the most painful themes running through this story. Years later, detectives reviewing witness statements noticed how often ordinary words appeared in extraordinary circumstances. He seemed polite. He smiled. He asked nicely. He didn't look dangerous. Those simple observations revealed an uncomfortable truth. Human beings often judge safety through appearance. A calm voice can lower defenses more effectively than force ever could. A friendly smile can open doors that violence alone cannot. Patrick Mackay understood this dynamic, whether instinctively or deliberately. The homes he entered were not fortresses breached through elaborate planning. They were places where trust still existed, places where a stranger could become a guest within seconds if he appeared respectful enough. But before he learned how to exploit trust, there had been another version of Patrick. Not an innocent child, but a young boy growing up in circumstances marked by instability, violence, and emotional neglect. His early years would later become the focus of psychiatrists, journalists, criminologists, and parole boards, all searching for an explanation that never fully satisfied. Explanation, however, is not the same as excuse. The distinction matters. Understanding how someone develops violent behavior does not erase responsibility for the choices that follow. It simply acknowledges that the path towards serious violence is often more complicated than a single moment of transformation. By the time Mackay reached adulthood, many people who had encountered him shared similar impressions. They described someone whose temper could change without warning. Someone capable of intimidation. Someone whose behavior inspired unease even before any homicide investigation began. What they could not know was how quickly that unease would evolve into fear. When investigators later reconstructed his movements, they discovered a life drifting between institutions that each attempted, in different ways, to manage his behavior. Schools struggled. Juvenile authorities intervened. Psychiatric professionals assessed him. Correctional facilities confined him. Yet none of these environments became a lasting turning point. Instead, they resembled temporary pauses in a trajectory that continued bending toward greater violence. It is tempting to imagine history as inevitable, to believe that every event unfolds exactly as it was always meant to. Real life is rarely so straightforward. Every decision creates alternatives that disappear the moment another choice is made. Every release from custody, every treatment plan, every evaluation represented a crossroads. Those making the decisions could not see the future. They worked with the information available at the time, balancing public safety with legal limits and the hope that rehabilitation remained possible. Only hindsight grants the illusion of certainty. The public often remembers notorious killers through the lens of their crimes alone. Their names become synonymous with horror while everything preceding the violence fades into the background. Yet the years before the murders often reveal just as much about the systems surrounding them as they do about the offender. The Mackay case became one such mirror. It reflected difficult questions about mental health services struggling with limited resources. It reflected the challenge of identifying which troubled young people might one day become genuinely dangerous. It reflected the uncomfortable reality that professionals cannot predict future violence with perfect accuracy, even when warning signs appear deeply concerning. Most importantly, it reminded society that extreme violence almost never emerges from a single cause. Family instability, repeated aggression, substance abuse, criminal behavior, personality disorders, environmental influences, and individual choices can intersect in ways that defy simple explanation. The temptation to reduce complex cases into neat narratives is understandable. Audiences often seek one decisive answer, one defining event, one moment when everything changed. This case refuses that simplicity. Instead, it unfolds through accumulation. One incident. Then another. Another warning. Another missed opportunity. Another escalation. Until eventually, the distance between troubling behavior and irreversible tragedy disappears altogether. As detectives worked through the evidence in 1975, they found themselves assembling more than a criminal investigation. They were reconstructing years of decisions, relationships, and encounters that stretched far beyond any single crime scene. Every witness contributed another fragment. Every interview expanded the timeline. Every document hinted that the story reaching the courtroom had begun long before the first body was discovered. Outside police stations, newspapers competed for every new development. Public curiosity intensified with each report. Some headlines portrayed Mackay as an inexplicable monster. Others focused on his psychiatric history. Still others questioned whether authorities could have prevented the killings. The debate quickly moved beyond one individual. It became a discussion about society itself. How should dangerous offenders be managed after release? What weight should psychiatric predictions carry? When does treatment become insufficient? How much risk is acceptable before restricting someone's freedom? These questions remain relevant today because no legal system has found perfect answers. Democracies must constantly balance civil liberties against public protection, knowing that certainty is impossible. Cases like Patrick Mackay's continue to influence those conversations decades later. Yet amid legal arguments and policy debates, another reality often fades into the background. The victims. Every investigation begins with someone who failed to return home, answer the telephone, or open their curtains one morning. Before forensic laboratories process fingerprints and before courtrooms hear testimony, there is always a family confronting silence where a familiar voice once existed. For them, criminal justice moves painfully slowly. The hours between disappearance and discovery feel endless. The days before an arrest become unbearable. The months before trial stretch into years measured not by calendars but by anniversaries of loss. No verdict can restore what violence has taken away. As this story unfolds, it is important to remember that the names appearing throughout the investigation belong to people whose lives extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. They laughed with friends, celebrated birthdays, worried about bills, attended church services, wrote letters, and planned for futures they expected to live. Those ordinary moments deserve as much attention as the crimes themselves. Because true crime is not only the story of those who inflict harm. It is equally the story of those whose lives are forever altered by it. And in the case of Patrick David Mackay, that circle of harm reached much further than the official court record could ever capture. Some families received answers. Others were left with only questions. Some deaths resulted in convictions. Others remained subjects of speculation. Some truths were established beyond reasonable doubt. Others still exist in the uncertain space between confession, evidence, and memory. That uncertainty is one reason this case continues to attract attention more than 50 years later. Not because of sensationalism, but because it sits at the intersection of psychology, criminal justice, and the enduring human search for understanding. The story that follows is built upon documented evidence, court proceedings, investigative findings, and the historical record. Where uncertainty exists, it will remain uncertainty. Where facts are established, they will stand on their own. And where lives were forever changed, they deserve to be remembered with the dignity that history sometimes forgets. Because before Patrick Mackay became one of Britain's most infamous killers, there were ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that a knock at the door would mark the final chapter of their story. There is a tendency, when looking back at notorious criminal cases, to search for the exact moment everything changed. A single decision. A single mistake. A single act that could have been prevented if only someone had acted differently. It is an understandable instinct. Human beings find comfort in believing that tragedy has a clear beginning, because if it has a beginning, perhaps it could have been stopped. The story of Patrick David Mackay offers no such comfort. Instead, it presents something far more unsettling. It is the story of countless moments that appeared ordinary on their own but became devastating when viewed together. A report that was filed. A warning that was acknowledged. A sentence that ended. A release that followed. None of these decisions seemed extraordinary in isolation. Together, they became the backdrop to one of Britain's most disturbing criminal cases of the 1970s. By the time Mackay's name became known across the country, investigators were no longer asking only who had committed these crimes. They were asking how a young man with such a long history of documented violence had continued moving through institutions without finding a lasting intervention. That question has echoed through decades of discussion among criminologists, psychologists, legal scholars, and law enforcement professionals. There is still no answer that satisfies everyone. Perhaps that is because some questions resist simple conclusions. Violence is rarely born from one source alone. Mental illness cannot explain every crime. Childhood abuse does not inevitably create violent adults. Personality disorders do not predetermine murder. And yet, ignoring these factors altogether would leave the story incomplete. The truth exists somewhere within that uncomfortable complexity. This is not a tale about destiny. It is not the story of a child who was fated to become a killer from the day he was born. Thousands of children endure difficult upbringings without ever committing serious crimes. Thousands of people struggle with mental health conditions while living peaceful and compassionate lives. Recognizing those realities is essential. They remind us that no single characteristic defines a person's future. Patrick Mackay made choices for which he was held criminally responsible. At the same time, his life exposed difficult questions about the limits of prediction, treatment, rehabilitation, and public protection. Those questions remain relevant today because every generation faces them anew. As this case unfolded, newspaper readers encountered details that seemed almost impossible to reconcile. On one page, they read about psychiatric evaluations describing an individual who had displayed persistent aggression from an early age. On another, they read about elderly victims whose daily routines reflected kindness rather than fear. The contrast was striking. Two entirely different worlds had collided without warning. One world believed in helping strangers. The other learned how to exploit that belief. Perhaps that contrast explains why this case continues to linger in public memory. It was not only the violence that shocked Britain. It was the ordinary setting in which that violence occurred. Quiet streets. Familiar neighborhoods. Modest homes. Places where danger was least expected. Fear changes communities in subtle ways. After highly publicized crimes, people hesitate before opening their doors. Neighbors become slightly more suspicious. Parents become more protective. Conversations that once ended with casual reassurance begin ending with caution instead. The consequences extend beyond the courtroom. They reshape everyday life. For many elderly people living alone during that period, trust gradually became more conditional. Simple gestures of generosity no longer felt entirely safe. The knowledge that someone could use politeness as a means of gaining entry altered perceptions in ways that statistics alone can never measure. Crime leaves physical evidence behind. It also leaves invisible evidence. The invisible kind often lasts much longer. Long after investigators archive case files, communities continue carrying memories that influence behavior for years, sometimes generations. That is why this story deserves to be told carefully. Not to glorify violence. Not to elevate the person responsible. But to understand the lives affected, the institutions challenged, and the lessons that remain relevant decades later. Every true crime case presents a choice in how it is remembered. Some become stories centered almost entirely on the offender, reducing victims to brief names within a timeline of criminal acts. Others attempt something different. They acknowledge the offender without allowing that individual to dominate every page of history. They recognize that the most meaningful legacy lies not in the notoriety of violence but in the humanity of those whose lives were interrupted by it. This story belongs in that second category. Patrick Mackay's name survives because of the crimes for which he was convicted and the unresolved questions surrounding additional confessions. But the deeper significance of the case lies elsewhere. It lies in the repeated warnings that challenged assumptions about risk assessment. It lies in the continuing debate over criminal responsibility and diminished responsibility. It lies in the enduring struggle to determine when society should prioritize rehabilitation, when it should prioritize containment, and whether it is ever possible to know with certainty which path is correct. Those debates are not confined to history books. They continue inside courtrooms, psychiatric hospitals, parole hearings, and policy discussions today. Each generation inherits them. Each generation must confront them again. As we begin retracing the events that led to Patrick Mackay's arrest, it is worth remembering that history is often reconstructed backward. We already know the ending. The people living through these events did not. Detectives collected evidence without knowing where it would lead. Families waited for answers without knowing whether they would ever come. Witnesses recalled conversations that seemed insignificant until tragedy gave them new meaning. Everything appeared ordinary until it no longer was. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. The line separating ordinary life from extraordinary tragedy is often invisible until after it has been crossed. A quiet street remains quiet. A familiar house still stands. A kettle still whistles in the kitchen. The morning paper still lands on the doorstep. Life appears unchanged. Yet somewhere, without public attention or dramatic announcement, another story has already begun. It begins with a child whose behavior increasingly alarms those around him. It continues through years of institutional intervention that never quite become lasting change. It reaches adulthood carrying unresolved violence into communities that have no reason to expect it. And eventually, it arrives at a front door where someone, acting out of simple courtesy, decides to let a stranger inside. That single decision cannot explain everything that followed. Neither can any diagnosis. Neither can any institution. Neither can any one moment in isolation. Only by examining the full sequence of events, the people involved, the documented history, the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the lasting consequences, can we begin to understand why the Patrick David Mackay case remains one of the most studied and debated criminal investigations in modern British history. Because this is not merely the story of crimes committed more than half a century ago. It is a story about warning signs that challenged professional judgment. It is a story about victims whose ordinary lives deserve to be remembered before they are remembered for the way they ended. It is a story about investigators who pursued facts through uncertainty rather than speculation. And above all, it is a reminder that justice does not begin in the courtroom. It begins with understanding what happened, why it happened, and what future generations might learn from a tragedy that no verdict could ever truly undo. That journey begins long before the first crime scene. It begins with a boy growing up in post-war Britain, in circumstances that would shape the earliest chapters of a life destined to leave behind questions that, even after 50 years, remain painfully unanswered. Post-war Britain carried an outward appearance of recovery, But beneath that image lay a society still healing from wounds that could not be measured in damaged buildings alone. The Second World War had ended years earlier, yet its echoes remained in family homes, in economic hardship, and in the emotional lives of those who had survived it. Children born during the early 1950s entered a country rebuilding itself brick by brick, street by street, and generation by generation. Opportunities were expanding, but so too were the pressures placed upon families struggling to adapt to a changing world. Patrick David Mackay was born on September 25, 1952, in England. At first glance, there was nothing about the date itself that hinted his name would someday appear in criminal history books. Like countless children born during that era, he entered a world shaped by ordinary hopes. Parents wished for stability after years of uncertainty. Communities sought normality. Schools prepared another generation for futures they believed would be brighter than the past. History rarely announces which child will later become infamous. The neighborhoods of Britain during the 1950s were built around familiarity. Milk bottles appeared outside front doors before dawn. Children walked to school without constant supervision. Churches remained gathering places where families shared not only faith but also news, comfort, and companionship. Elderly residents often knew every family living on their street. Shopkeepers recognized customers by name. It was a society that depended heavily upon trust. Yet behind the closed doors of many homes, private struggles remained exactly that, private. Domestic violence was discussed far less openly than it is today. Emotional trauma often went unnamed. Parents who carried psychological scars from war sometimes lacked the tools to manage their own pain, let alone guide their children's emotional development. Mental health services existed, but public understanding remained limited, and stigma discouraged many families from seeking help. It was within this environment that Patrick Mackay spent his earliest years. Historical accounts indicate that his childhood was marked by violence inside the home. Reports describe a father whose treatment of him was physically abusive, creating an atmosphere where fear became a recurring part of daily life. Researchers who have studied violent offenders frequently emphasize that abuse alone does not determine a person's future. Most children who experience violence never become violent criminals themselves. Nevertheless, prolonged exposure to abuse can profoundly affect emotional development, impulse control, and the ability to form secure relationships. In Patrick's case, those early experiences formed only one part of a much larger picture. Teachers and adults gradually began noticing behaviors that extended beyond ordinary childhood mischief. While many children occasionally fought with classmates or displayed anger, Patrick's actions reportedly reflected a persistent pattern of aggression. Accounts from later investigations describe bullying, intimidation, and acts of cruelty that disturbed those around him. These behaviors were significant not because they predicted an inevitable future, but because they suggested a child struggling with serious behavioral difficulties requiring sustained intervention. As the years passed, concern grew. Adults attempted to understand what they were witnessing. Was this a boy acting out because of the violence he experienced at home? Was he emotionally disturbed? Could structure and treatment redirect his behavior? Or were these signs pointing toward something more deeply rooted? No one could answer those questions with certainty. Modern psychology recognizes that human behavior develops through a complex interaction of biological, psychological, and environmental influences. There is no single formula capable of predicting who will become a violent offender. Risk factors increase concern, but they do not dictate outcomes. This distinction is essential when examining Patrick Mackay's childhood. Looking backward, it is easy to see warning signs. Looking forward, the future remained uncertain for everyone involved. One of the most frequently discussed aspects of Mackay's early life concerns his interaction with mental health professionals during adolescence. Historical records indicate that, at approximately 15 years old, he underwent psychiatric evaluation after repeated behavioral problems. According to published accounts, one psychiatrist expressed grave concern about the level of danger he might one day pose if his violent behavior continued unchecked. That assessment has become one of the most widely cited elements of the entire case. It is often remembered because later events appeared to validate those concerns. Yet even this moment deserves careful context. Psychiatric evaluations are clinical opinions based upon available evidence, not guarantees of future behavior. Mental health professionals routinely assess risk, but predicting individual acts of violence with certainty remains impossible. The significance of this evaluation lies not in its perceived accuracy alone, but in the fact that professionals had already identified Patrick as someone requiring serious attention long before the murders that would later define his public image. Those assessments were followed by repeated contact with institutions designed to address troubled youth. Patrick moved through schools, juvenile facilities, psychiatric hospitals, and periods of detention. Each environment represented an effort, however limited by the standards and resources of the time, to manage escalating behavioral problems. Some interventions were short. Others lasted longer. None ultimately produced lasting stability. To understand why, it is necessary to appreciate the broader state of mental health care during Britain in the 1960s and early 1970s. Psychiatry itself was undergoing significant change. Ideas surrounding treatment, rehabilitation, institutional care, and community integration were evolving rapidly. Professionals often worked with limited scientific evidence compared to what is available today. Diagnostic categories differed. Effective long-term treatments for severe personality-related difficulties were limited. Decisions frequently involved balancing optimism for rehabilitation against practical constraints on institutional care. Within that system, many difficult choices had to be made. How long should someone remain confined if they had not committed a serious violent offense? Could behavioral improvement inside an institution predict safe behavior outside it? When should society prioritize treatment over restriction? These questions remain challenging even today. For Patrick Mackay, the answers changed repeatedly as he moved from one setting to another. By the early 1970s, he had entered adulthood carrying a documented history of aggression alongside increasing involvement with alcohol, drugs, and criminal behavior. These developments compounded existing concerns rather than replacing them. Substance misuse can intensify impulsivity, impair judgment, and increase the likelihood of violent confrontation in some individuals, though it does not by itself explain serious criminal conduct. Meanwhile, his life became increasingly unstable. Employment proved inconsistent. Relationships lacked permanence. Encounters with law enforcement accumulated. The gap between rehabilitation and recurring criminality widened. People who crossed paths with Patrick during these years described someone capable of appearing calm one moment and intimidating the next. Such recollections emerged largely after his arrest, and like many retrospective accounts, they were inevitably shaped by knowledge of later events. Even so, they contributed to an overall picture of an individual whose volatility had become familiar to those around him. Outside his personal life, London itself continued moving forward. Markets opened every morning. Commuters crowded railway platforms. Children hurried through school gates carrying satchels nearly as large as themselves. Churches welcomed parishioners seeking comfort, routine, and community. For most residents, life unfolded according to ordinary expectations. Very few could imagine that the quiet routines of elderly people living alone would soon intersect with the path of a man whose history had already generated years of professional concern. The tragedy that followed would ultimately raise questions extending far beyond one individual. It would prompt renewed examination of how societies identify high-risk behavior, how institutions respond to persistent violence, and how difficult it is to balance compassion for troubled individuals with responsibility for protecting the wider public. Those questions had not yet reached newspaper headlines. At this stage, Patrick Mackay was still largely unknown outside the professionals, officials, and acquaintances who had encountered him over the years. The country had no reason to recognize his name. The victims had no reason to fear it. And the ordinary rhythm of London continued, unaware that the events soon to unfold would transform one troubled life into a case that criminologists, investigators, and historians would continue studying for decades. As Patrick Mackay moved from adolescence into adulthood, The divide between the life he might have lived and the one he ultimately chose appeared to widen with each passing year. By the early 1970s, Britain was experiencing profound social and economic change. Factories closed, unemployment rose in many areas, and political unrest dominated newspaper headlines. Yet for most people, daily life remained grounded in familiar routines. Men left home early for work, children filled school playgrounds with laughter, and elderly residents continued to maintain modest homes that reflected decades of careful living. For someone standing on a London street during those years, nothing suggested that the city was on the verge of becoming the setting for one of its most unsettling criminal investigations. Patrick, however, was living on the margins of that ordinary world. Historical records indicate that after his release from institutional care in the early 1970s, he struggled to establish a stable life. Employment was inconsistent, and he became increasingly involved with alcohol and drugs. Substance misuse did not create the violent tendencies that had already concerned professionals for years, but it formed part of a broader pattern of instability that affected his judgment, relationships, and day-to-day behavior. Those who encountered him often described someone whose demeanor could shift dramatically. At times he appeared quiet, even polite. At other moments, his temper surfaced with little warning. Such observations, while subjective, echoed concerns that had followed him since childhood. Violence was no longer viewed as isolated incidents. It had become part of an established behavioral pattern. Another aspect of Mackay's life that later drew public attention was his fascination with Nazi memorabilia and Adolf Hitler. Investigators documented this interest after his arrest, and it became widely reported in the press. Historians and psychologists have cautioned, however, that possession of extremist symbols or fascination with notorious historical figures does not by itself explain violent criminal behavior. In Mackay's case, it was regarded as one element within a much broader profile rather than a direct cause of his crimes. As his personal life grew increasingly chaotic, so too did his criminal activity. The offenses that first brought him into contact with the justice system were not homicide. They involved theft, burglary, assault, and other acts reflecting a willingness to violate both legal and social boundaries. Each arrest represented another point of contact between Patrick and institutions attempting to manage his behavior. Each release reflected the legal reality that sentences are determined by the crimes that have actually been committed, not by speculation about future offenses. This distinction remains one of the most difficult aspects of criminal justice. Authorities cannot imprison someone indefinitely based solely on fears about what they might someday do. Democratic legal systems require evidence, due process, and proportional punishment. Even individuals regarded as highly problematic retain legal rights. The Mackay case would later become an example frequently discussed in relation to these tensions. During these same years, another story was unfolding entirely separately. Across London, thousands of elderly men and women were entering retirement after lifetimes shaped by war, sacrifice, and rebuilding. Many had spent decades raising families, working steady jobs, and contributing quietly to their communities. Their homes reflected lives of discipline rather than luxury. Framed family photographs stood on mantelpieces. Carefully polished furniture remained in the same position for years. Tea was served in familiar cups that had survived countless ordinary afternoons. These homes represented safety. For older generations especially, home was more than shelter. It was memory itself. Every photograph marked a birthday or wedding. Every chair had a favorite occupant. Every clock ticking softly on the wall measured years rather than minutes. Many of these residents lived alone after losing spouses. Loneliness was common, but so too was resilience. They developed routines that brought structure to each day. Shopping occurred at familiar stores. Church services provided companionship. Neighbors checked in from time to time. Small conversations on the doorstep helped ease the silence that often accompanied old age. Trust remained part of that routine. Someone asking politely for help might receive it without hesitation. Someone requesting a glass of water would rarely be viewed as a threat. Looking back through modern eyes, such openness can seem almost unimaginable. Today, public awareness campaigns frequently advise caution before opening doors to strangers. Security cameras, intercom systems, and neighborhood watch programs have become increasingly common. In the Britain of the early 1970s, many communities still operated according to older assumptions. Courtesy came naturally. Suspicion did not. It is impossible to understand this case without appreciating that difference. The victims did not behave recklessly. They behaved normally for their time. That distinction matters because it shifts attention away from questioning the victim's decisions and toward understanding how ordinary acts of kindness could be manipulated by someone willing to abuse them. While London continued its daily rhythm, Patrick's world grew narrower. Rather than forming stable relationships or pursuing consistent employment, his life increasingly revolved around short-term survival, criminal opportunities, and substance use. Investigators would later reconstruct many aspects of this period through interviews, official records, and evidence collected after his arrest. The picture that emerged was not one of careful long-term planning but of escalating instability. Yet instability alone does not explain what came next. Many individuals experience homelessness, addiction, unemployment, or emotional turmoil without committing acts of lethal violence. The progression from criminality to homicide involves choices that cannot be reduced to circumstance alone. That progression, however, rarely occurs in isolation. Criminologists often describe violent offending as the product of multiple interacting influences rather than a single cause. In Patrick Mackay's life, childhood abuse, long-standing aggression, institutional involvement, substance misuse, and repeated criminal conduct all formed part of the documented background. None of these elements individually predetermined murder. Together, they created an increasingly concerning pattern. By the beginning of 1974, few outside official circles knew Patrick Mackay's name. He was simply another young man whose life had repeatedly intersected with police, courts, and psychiatric services. There was no national manhunt. No newspaper profile. No public warning. The people whose paths would soon cross his had no knowledge of his past. To them, he would appear as little more than another face in one of Europe's busiest cities. That anonymity became one of his greatest advantages. Large cities possess a unique paradox. Millions of people share the same streets while remaining complete strangers to one another. A person can disappear into crowds within seconds. Brief encounters rarely leave lasting impressions. Someone seen on a bus one morning may never be seen again. This constant flow of unfamiliar faces creates opportunity not only for ordinary life but also for those who exploit anonymity. London offered exactly that environment. Bustling shopping districts merged into quiet residential streets. Historic churches stood only minutes away from busy commercial centers. Elegant neighborhoods bordered more modest ones. The city contained countless lives unfolding simultaneously, each unaware of the others. Somewhere within that vast landscape, Patrick Mackay continued moving through daily life without attracting widespread attention. Soon, however, the ordinary routines of several households would come to an abrupt and devastating end. Doors that had welcomed friends for decades would become crime scenes. Family members expecting routine visits would instead receive unimaginable news. Detectives who initially believed they were investigating isolated acts of violence would gradually discover connections hidden beneath the surface. And a name that had previously existed only within institutional records would become known across Britain not because of what professionals had once feared, but because those fears would now be tested against a series of crimes that challenged investigators, the courts, and the public alike. The quiet foundation of this story had now been laid. The ordinary world and Patrick Mackay's increasingly unstable world were moving toward one another. Before long, they would collide in a way that neither the victims nor the communities they called home could possibly have anticipated. By the middle of the 1970s, two very different versions of London existed side by side, though few people consciously recognized the contrast. One was the city celebrated in postcards and travel guides, where visitors admired historic cathedrals, bustling markets, and rows of elegant Victorian houses that had survived war and redevelopment alike. The other was quieter, hidden behind those same brick facades, where thousands of people, particularly the elderly, spent long afternoons alone, filling silence with routine. A kettle placed on the stove at the same hour every afternoon. A favorite chair beside the window. Fresh flowers arranged carefully in a vase. A Bible resting on a bedside table. Family photographs fading slightly under years of sunlight. These homes represented lives that had been built patiently over decades. Most of the people living in them had already experienced hardships that younger generations could scarcely imagine. They had lived through wartime rationing, air raids, economic uncertainty, and the slow rebuilding of a nation. Having endured those years, many believed they understood danger. They associated it with bomb sirens, blackouts, or distant battlefields, not with the simple act of answering a knock at the front door on an ordinary afternoon. That belief reflected the values of their generation. Hospitality was considered a virtue. Helping someone in apparent need required little thought. A polite conversation on the doorstep was part of everyday life. Trust was woven into the social fabric of countless neighborhoods. It is important to remember this context because it explains why later investigators repeatedly encountered similar circumstances during witness interviews. Friends described the victims as generous. Neighbors remembered them greeting passers-by with a smile. Local shopkeepers spoke of familiar customers who rarely missed their weekly visits. These descriptions were not extraordinary. They portrayed ordinary people whose greatest strength and, tragically, greatest vulnerability was their enduring faith in human decency. While these communities continued following familiar rhythms, Patrick Mackay's life remained marked by instability. Historical accounts suggest that he drifted between temporary accommodations and periods of uncertainty, never establishing the stable routines that often anchor adult life. Instead of building lasting relationships or pursuing consistent employment, he moved through an existence increasingly shaped by impulsive decisions, substance misuse, and recurring contact with the criminal justice system. To those who met him only briefly, he may not have seemed especially remarkable. Cities are filled with individuals carrying unseen struggles. Some battle addiction. Some struggle with untreated mental illness. Others simply drift through difficult periods before eventually finding stability. Patrick Mackay appeared, at least outwardly, to be one more troubled young man navigating an uncertain future. The profound danger lay not in what strangers could observe, but in the documented history they could not. Court records, institutional reports, and psychiatric evaluations remained confined to official files. The elderly residents who would later become victims had no access to that history. They encountered only the person standing before them in the present moment. Like anyone else meeting a stranger, they judged character through appearance, voice, and behavior during those first few seconds. Those first impressions mattered. A respectful greeting lowers suspicion. A calm tone creates familiarity. Small requests often seem harmless. Human beings are naturally inclined to respond to politeness with politeness. That tendency exists because, in most situations, it serves society well. Communities depend upon mutual trust. Neighbors help neighbors. Strangers occasionally rely upon one another. Everyday kindness makes ordinary life possible. Cases like Patrick Mackay's remain so deeply unsettling because they reveal how those same qualities can be deliberately exploited. Yet this story is not simply about manipulation. It is equally about opportunity. Throughout history, criminologists have observed that crime often occurs when a motivated offender encounters a suitable target in the absence of effective guardianship. Elderly individuals living alone represented a particularly vulnerable population, not because they lacked intelligence or awareness, but because physical frailty, social isolation, and long-standing habits of trust sometimes combined to reduce their ability to respond to unexpected threats. Understanding vulnerability should never be confused with assigning blame. Responsibility rests solely with the offender. The victims were living ordinary lives according to the social expectations of their time. That distinction deserves emphasis because true crime narratives too often invite hindsight judgments that overlook historical context. As investigators would later discover, The crimes attributed to Patrick Mackay did not emerge from elaborate conspiracies or sophisticated criminal planning. Instead, they unfolded within everyday settings that countless Londoners considered entirely unremarkable. Quiet residential streets, familiar neighborhoods, comfortable homes, places where children played after school and church bells marked the passing hours. Those ordinary surroundings intensified the emotional impact of the investigation. Violence occurring in expected places of safety often leaves deeper psychological scars on communities than violence occurring in locations already associated with risk. Residents who had lived peacefully for decades suddenly questioned routines they had never before considered dangerous. Doors that once opened without hesitation remained locked. Conversations between neighbors increasingly included reminders to exercise caution. A subtle but unmistakable shift occurred in how safety itself was understood. These broader social consequences rarely appear in court transcripts. They unfold gradually. One family installs stronger locks. Another begins telephoning elderly relatives every evening. A church organizes volunteers to check on members living alone. Communities adapt, often without fully realizing that fear has quietly reshaped daily behavior. Long after the investigation concluded, those invisible changes remained part of its legacy. Meanwhile, the criminal justice system continued operating according to the information available at each moment. Detectives investigated individual crimes. Prosecutors assembled evidence meeting legal standards. Psychiatrists offered clinical opinions rather than certainties. Judges applied laws written to balance public safety with individual rights. Each institution performed its role within defined limits, yet the Patrick Mackay case would later prompt renewed debate about whether those limits were sufficient when confronting individuals displaying persistent patterns of serious violence. Such debates are rarely straightforward. Public expectations often change after tragedy. Policies that seem appropriate during ordinary times may appear inadequate once devastating outcomes become known. Looking backward creates an illusion that different choices would have guaranteed different results. Reality is seldom that simple. Still, difficult questions deserve examination precisely because certainty is impossible. Could earlier intervention have altered Mackay's path? Would longer institutional treatment have reduced the risk? Were existing legal powers sufficient? Could anyone have predicted the precise course events would take? Decades later, these questions continue to generate thoughtful disagreement among experts. What remains beyond dispute is the profound loss experienced by the victims' families and communities. Every homicide investigation begins with absence. An unanswered telephone. Curtains that remain closed longer than usual. A missed church service. A concerned neighbor deciding to knock on the door. These ordinary moments often become the first indications that something has gone terribly wrong. For detectives, they mark the beginning of an investigation. For families, they mark the beginning of grief. As Patrick Mackay moved through London largely unnoticed, none of those future investigations had yet begun. Police officers carried out routine duties across the city. Detectives solved burglaries, interviewed witnesses, and responded to the countless incidents that occupy every major metropolitan police force. There was no indication that they were approaching a case that would later become one of the most discussed examples of violent offending, psychiatric assessment, and criminal responsibility in modern British history. The stage had now been quietly set. A troubled young man with a documented history of aggression was moving through a city built upon everyday trust. Elderly residents continued opening their doors to polite strangers. Communities remained unaware that their sense of security was about to be tested. And somewhere within that ordinary rhythm, the first chapter of irreversible tragedy was waiting to begin, not with dramatic fanfare or public warning, but with an encounter that, at first glance, appeared no different from countless others that occurred every single day across London. Every victim in a criminal case leaves behind more than a name recorded in police files. They leave behind routines that suddenly stop, conversations that are never finished, chairs that remain empty at family gatherings, and homes that continue standing long after the laughter inside them has faded. When history remembers only the identity of an offender, it risks overlooking the people whose lives gave the case its deepest human meaning. Before Patrick David Mackay became associated with one of Britain's most troubling homicide investigations, there were ordinary individuals whose stories deserved to be told on their own terms. Among them was Isabella Griffiths. She was 84 years old, an age that reflected not weakness but endurance. She belonged to a generation that had witnessed more change than most people experience in a lifetime. She had lived through 2 world wars, periods of rationing, economic uncertainty, and the gradual transformation of Britain from the years of post-war reconstruction into the modern age. Like many elderly people of her generation, her greatest wealth was not measured in money or possessions but in memories collected across decades. Chelsea, where she lived, was already a neighborhood known for its mixture of history and quiet elegance. Tree-lined streets, rows of terraced houses, and small local shops created an atmosphere where daily life moved at a gentler pace than the crowded commercial districts of central London. Residents often recognized familiar faces during morning walks. The owner of a nearby shop might know exactly which newspaper a regular customer preferred. A passing greeting carried genuine warmth rather than obligation. For Isabella, these familiar surroundings offered comfort. The walls of her home represented years of ordinary living. Every room reflected habits formed over a lifetime. Furniture remained where it had always been. Photographs preserved birthdays, anniversaries, and family milestones that had slowly become treasured reminders of years gone by. The clock on the mantel continued marking each passing hour with quiet consistency, indifferent to the changes taking place beyond its walls. Neighbors later described a woman who valued simple routines. She did not seek attention. She was simply another elderly resident living independently, navigating each day with quiet dignity. For people who live alone in later life, routine often becomes a source of stability. Morning begins with opening the curtains to let daylight fill familiar rooms. Tea is prepared almost automatically, each movement practiced thousands of times before. Mail is collected from the front door. Small errands provide opportunities for brief conversations that break the silence of the afternoon. These rituals may appear ordinary, but they create structure, purpose, and connection. There is something profoundly human about such routines. They remind us that most lives are not defined by extraordinary events but by countless ordinary moments repeated with quiet consistency. Isabella's life reflected exactly that truth. Elsewhere in London lived another woman whose story would also become part of this case. Adele Price belonged to the same generation that had learned resilience through experience. Historical records describe her as an elderly woman living alone, maintaining the independence that so many older adults value deeply. Like Isabella, she occupied a modest home shaped by familiarity rather than luxury. Every object inside carried practical purpose or personal meaning accumulated across many years. People who knew Adele remembered everyday qualities that rarely appear in official documents. Kindness, courtesy, patience. These characteristics seldom make newspaper headlines, yet they define the lives of countless people far more accurately than dramatic events ever could. The neighborhoods where women like Isabella and Adele lived were communities built upon repeated encounters. Local shopkeepers exchanged greetings with regular customers. Church congregations provided companionship extending beyond Sunday services. Neighbors noticed when curtains remained closed later than usual or when someone failed to appear for a customary walk. These small observations formed an informal network of care long before modern technology made constant communication possible. For older adults living independently, such communities offered reassurance. Someone would eventually notice if something seemed wrong. Yet even close-knit neighborhoods possess limits. A closed front door conceals both peaceful afternoons and unimaginable tragedy with equal effectiveness. The final victim whose death would lead directly to Patrick Mackay's arrest came from a very different background. Father Anthony Crean devoted his life to serving others through his ministry. Historical accounts describe him as a Catholic priest known for helping people in need, offering practical assistance alongside spiritual guidance. Clergy often occupy unique positions within their communities. They counsel those experiencing hardship, welcome strangers seeking support, and frequently extend compassion to individuals whom others have rejected. That commitment to helping others shaped Father Crean's daily life. His home was more than a private residence. It was a place where people could seek advice, comfort, or assistance. Those who dedicate themselves to service often develop an instinct to see possibility before danger. They look beyond a person's past in the hope that kindness might encourage change. Such generosity reflects courage and faith, even though it sometimes carries personal risk. Historical records indicate that Father Crean had previously tried to help Patrick Mackay. That detail has remained one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the entire case. It illustrates the tragic intersection between compassion and exploitation. Acts of kindness are among humanity's greatest strengths. They can also be manipulated by individuals willing to betray trust. Remembering Father Crean solely as a victim would overlook the life he lived before violence entered it. He represented countless clergy members whose work takes place quietly, away from public attention, through visits to the sick, conversations with those facing hardship, and steady support for people struggling to find hope. His story, like those of Isabella Griffiths and Adele Price, deserves to begin with life rather than loss. Looking across these three individuals, a common thread becomes clear. None sought public recognition. None expected to become part of a criminal investigation that would be discussed decades later. Their lives reflected ordinary decency. They belonged to communities built upon trust, routine, and mutual respect. It is precisely that ordinary humanity that makes their stories so significant. True crime often focuses intensely on offenders because criminal behavior attracts public fascination. Yet every minute spent examining the person responsible should be balanced by remembering those whose futures were taken away. The victims' lives extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. They had favorite meals, treasured photographs, familiar voices on the telephone, birthdays marked by family gatherings, and memories known only to those closest to them. Those details rarely survive in official case files. Police records document evidence. Courts establish legal facts. Neither can fully capture a lifetime. As investigators would later reconstruct the timeline surrounding these deaths, they were not merely identifying victims. They were restoring identities. Each interview with neighbors, relatives, and friends added another layer to lives that deserved to be remembered in full. Each family photograph collected during the investigation represented years that no act of violence could erase. Each personal belonging recovered from a home spoke silently of routines interrupted without warning. Long before forensic evidence entered the story, there were ordinary mornings filled with familiar habits. Long before newspaper headlines carried Patrick Mackay's name, Isabella Griffiths opened her curtains to another day she expected to unfold like so many before it. Adele Price continued living independently with the quiet confidence earned through decades of resilience. Father Anthony Crean continued believing that extending compassion to another human being remained part of his calling. None of them could have known that their paths were moving toward the same investigation. None of them could have imagined that their names would one day be linked together in one of Britain's most enduring true crime cases. Their stories began not with violence, but with lives of quiet dignity. That is where they deserve to be remembered first. For the families and friends of Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean, the names that would later appear in newspaper archives had always meant something entirely different. They were not victims. They were mothers, relatives, neighbors, parishioners, trusted friends, and familiar faces whose presence blended naturally into the rhythm of everyday life. Long before police files assigned case numbers or investigators assembled timelines, these three individuals occupied places in the lives of others that could never be replaced. There is a quiet dignity that often accompanies old age. After decades of working, raising families, overcoming hardships, and adapting to an ever-changing world, many people begin to measure time differently. Ambition gives way to appreciation. Grand achievements matter less than ordinary mornings spent in peace. A familiar cup of tea, the sound of rain against the window, the greeting of a neighbor walking past the garden gate, these simple moments become life's greatest comforts. For Isabella Griffiths, those comforts had been earned over the course of more than 8 decades. By every historical account available, she represented a generation shaped by resilience rather than recognition. People who lived through the first half of the 20th century had witnessed extraordinary events, yet many rarely spoke about them in dramatic terms. Survival itself became part of their character. They carried on because that was what life required. Inside her home, time seemed to move more slowly than in the bustling streets beyond Chelsea. Furniture had likely occupied the same corners for years. Family photographs quietly documented the passage of time. Faces in black and white portraits gradually gave way to newer color photographs, each preserving another chapter of family history. Some people pictured they had grown older. Others may already have been gone. Yet together they transformed an ordinary house into something deeply personal. A home like that cannot be recreated. It grows over decades. Every object acquires meaning through memory rather than value. The same could be said of Adele Price. Although fewer historical details survive regarding her personal life, the available records paint the portrait of another elderly woman living independently in London, maintaining the quiet routines that had carried her through later life. Her independence itself reflected determination. For many older adults, remaining in one's own home represents more than convenience. It symbolizes continuity, familiarity, and the ability to preserve a lifetime of memories within walls that have witnessed countless ordinary days. There is something profoundly comforting about familiarity. Knowing which floorboard creaks. Knowing exactly where sunlight reaches the kitchen table every afternoon. Knowing which chair offers the best view through the window. These details rarely seem important until they are gone. Neighbors later remembered women like Isabella and Adele not because they lived extraordinary lives, but because they embodied the ordinary kindness that held communities together. They exchanged greetings. They appreciated small conversations. They belonged to neighborhoods where people still recognized one another without needing introductions. Such communities create an invisible sense of security. People notice when curtains remain closed. They notice when newspapers accumulate outside the front door. They notice when someone misses church or fails to appear during a routine shopping trip. These observations arise not from surveillance but from genuine familiarity. Father Anthony Crean occupied a somewhat different place within his community, yet the same spirit of service defined his daily life. As a Catholic priest, his responsibilities extended far beyond conducting religious ceremonies. Clergy often become listeners during moments of grief, counselors during periods of uncertainty, and steady sources of reassurance for people carrying burdens they struggle to share with anyone else. Those who dedicate themselves to pastoral care rarely know the full impact of their work. Some conversations last only minutes yet remain unforgettable for the person receiving encouragement. Some acts of generosity occur quietly, without public recognition. Many never appear in written records at all. Historical accounts indicate that Father Crean had previously tried to help Patrick Mackay during a difficult period in the younger man's life. That decision reflected the values central to his vocation. Faith communities frequently encourage compassion toward those who appear lost, troubled, or isolated. Extending help to someone in need was not extraordinary for Father Crean. It was part of who he was. Viewed through that lens, the later events become especially tragic. Not because kindness was misplaced, but because kindness encountered someone willing to abuse it. That distinction is important. Acts of compassion should never be judged solely by their outcomes. Countless people are helped every day because someone chooses generosity over suspicion. Cases such as this remain exceptional precisely because they violate expectations that normally strengthen communities rather than endanger them. As investigators later reconstructed the lives of the victims, they discovered something that appears repeatedly in homicide investigations involving elderly people. Ordinary routines leave remarkably detailed traces. A half-finished crossword puzzle. A pair of reading glasses resting beside an armchair. Letters waiting to be answered. Groceries recently purchased. A calendar with upcoming appointments carefully marked. These objects become silent witnesses to lives interrupted unexpectedly. Unlike dramatic scenes portrayed in fiction, real investigations often begin with such ordinary details. They remind investigators that before there was a crime, there was simply a person living another ordinary day. This perspective shaped much of the work undertaken by detectives assigned to the case. Every interview sought more than factual information. It sought understanding. Who was this person? What mattered to them? Who would notice first if something seemed wrong? When had they last been seen carrying out their usual routine? These questions transformed anonymous victims into individuals with histories, relationships, and communities. The answers also revealed how deeply integrated each victim had been within everyday life. Friends expected regular conversations. Neighbors expected familiar greetings. Parishioners expected to see Father Crean continuing his ministry. When those expectations suddenly went unmet, concern gradually replaced routine. One of the most heartbreaking realities surrounding crimes against elderly victims is that they often possess relatively modest material wealth. Their homes may contain cherished belongings accumulated over decades, yet few live extravagant lives. Their greatest treasures are frequently sentimental rather than financial. A photograph cannot be replaced. Neither can a handwritten letter, nor a wedding ring worn for half a century. The value of such possessions lies not in what they could be sold for, but in the memories they carry. This makes crimes involving elderly victims particularly painful for surviving families. Loss extends beyond the person. It reaches into the physical spaces where memories were created. Returning to a loved one's home after tragedy often becomes an emotional experience unlike any other. Everything appears exactly where it always belonged, yet the absence of the person who gave those objects meaning transforms the entire house. The silence feels different. The familiar no longer feels comforting. Every room becomes a reminder. For Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean, that silence would eventually become part of the legacy left behind for those who loved them. Yet before that silence arrived, each had lived lives defined far more by generosity, perseverance, and quiet routine than by the violence that would later dominate public memory. That truth deserves to remain at the center of this story. Because true crime should never reduce victims to the circumstances of their deaths. Their identities existed long before the investigation began. They laughed long before detectives interviewed witnesses. They formed friendships long before newspaper headlines appeared. They contributed to their communities in ways that official records can never fully capture. As this case moves toward the events that would forever alter those ordinary lives, it is worth pausing on one final observation. None of these individuals woke on those mornings believing they were stepping into history. They expected another ordinary day. Another familiar routine. Another quiet evening waiting just beyond sunset. The ordinary nature of those expectations is precisely what makes their stories so enduring. They remind us that behind every famous criminal case stand ordinary people whose greatest wish was simply to continue living the lives they had patiently built. That humanity, not the notoriety of the offender, is what gives this case its lasting emotional weight. The tragedy surrounding Patrick Mackay's crimes is often remembered through dates, locations, and legal proceedings. Investigators recorded evidence. Newspapers recorded headlines. Courts recorded verdicts. But behind every official document existed a much larger story, the story of people whose lives had been built quietly over many years. That is the part of history that is easiest to lose. A criminal investigation naturally focuses on the person responsible. Detectives must identify suspects. Prosecutors must prove responsibility. The public searches for explanations. Yet the people most affected by violence are often the ones whose names appear only briefly before attention shifts elsewhere. For Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean, life was not defined by the circumstances that brought them into a police investigation. Their lives were defined by everything that came before. By the relationships they built. By the kindness they showed. By the routines they maintained. By the small moments that made their existence meaningful. In many ways, their stories represented the thousands of ordinary lives that rarely appear in history books because they were never intended to become part of a public narrative. They were not celebrities, politicians, or figures who sought attention. They were simply people moving through the world, contributing to their communities in ways that were easy to overlook precisely because they were so natural. And that is why their loss carried such weight. When a person who has lived for decades disappears from a community, the absence is felt in countless small ways. A neighbor no longer receives a familiar greeting. A shopkeeper notices a regular customer has stopped visiting. A telephone remains unanswered. A seat in a church becomes empty. These moments create a different kind of grief, the grief of a community realizing that a familiar presence has vanished. For elderly people especially, independence often becomes a deeply valued part of identity. After spending a lifetime making decisions, caring for families, and managing personal responsibilities, many resist the idea that they are fragile or dependent. Their homes become symbols of that independence. A house is not merely a building. It is a record of a life. The marks on the walls, the objects carefully stored away, the photographs displayed in visible places, each carries a memory that exists nowhere else. This is why crimes committed inside someone's home feel particularly disturbing. A place designed for comfort and safety becomes associated with fear and loss. The emotional impact extends beyond the individual victim. Families and communities must redefine their relationship with a space that once represented security. For those who knew Isabella Griffiths, the image left behind was not of a crime scene. It was of an elderly woman who had lived through extraordinary decades of change. She had witnessed the world transform around her. Horse-drawn vehicles had given way to modern transportation. Communication had changed dramatically. Cities had expanded and evolved. Entire generations had been born and grown old during her lifetime. Yet through all those changes, she remained part of a familiar social world where courtesy mattered. Where neighbors looked after one another. Where helping someone in need was considered a simple human responsibility. That same understanding shaped the life of Adele Price. Although fewer personal details about Adele remain in public records, that absence should not be mistaken for a lack of significance. Many lives disappear from historical memory not because they were unimportant, but because they were ordinary in the best possible sense. Adele's life was likely filled with moments that would never make headlines. Conversations with friends. Quiet mornings. Personal memories collected over many years. The routines that gave structure to her days. These are the experiences that define most human lives. Not dramatic events. Not public recognition. But thousands of small moments that, together, create a complete existence. Father Anthony Creen's life followed a different path, one centered around service and connection. As a priest, he occupied a role that required patience, empathy, and a willingness to meet people during their most difficult moments. Those who seek help from religious figures often do so when they feel uncertain, isolated, or overwhelmed. A priest may become a source of stability during times when everything else feels unstable. That responsibility requires trust. And trust was central to Father Creen's work. He was part of a tradition that views compassion not as a temporary gesture, but as a lifelong commitment. Helping someone struggling with their circumstances was not an unusual act. It was part of the purpose he had chosen. This makes the circumstances surrounding his death particularly painful because it represented a betrayal of one of the fundamental principles upon which his life was built, the belief that people could be reached through understanding and support. However, remembering Father Creen only through the lens of tragedy would also be incomplete. His legacy was not created by the person who harmed him. It was created by the people he helped. By the conversations he shared. By the comfort he offered. By the community he served. The same principle applies to Isabella and Adele. Their lives were not measured by the final moments that ended them. They were measured by everything that came before. This distinction is essential when examining true crime cases. Violence has a tendency to erase individuality. A victim's identity can become reduced to a name beside a date. But behind every name exists an entire universe of experiences that cannot be captured in a single sentence. Someone remembered their voice. Someone knew their favorite foods. Someone laughed with them years earlier. Someone received kindness from them without ever realizing how meaningful that moment would become. These connections are what make loss so painful. The death of a person does not remove their impact. It reveals how many lives they touched. As investigators later worked to understand the crimes connected to Patrick Mackay, they were forced to reconstruct not only events but people. They had to examine the lives interrupted, the relationships damaged, and the communities changed forever. A murder investigation is often described as a search for truth. But truth is not limited to identifying an offender. Truth also means understanding what was taken away. It means recognizing that every victim had a story before becoming part of a case file. It means acknowledging that the absence left behind can never be fully repaired by a conviction. Justice can establish responsibility. It can provide answers. It can bring a measure of closure. But it cannot return a morning conversation. It cannot restore a familiar presence at the dinner table. It cannot rewind time to before tragedy entered a home. That reality remained with the families and communities connected to this case. Long after the courtroom proceedings ended, the memories of Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean continued beyond the investigation that brought their names into public attention. Their lives represented something much larger than the crimes committed against them. They represented the generation that rebuilt Britain after war. They represented the quiet strength found in ordinary people. They represented the importance of kindness, faith, independence, and community. And perhaps most importantly, they represented a reminder that behind every criminal case are human beings whose stories deserve to be told with care. Before the investigation begins. Before evidence is collected. Before a suspect is named. There are always lives being lived. And those lives matter. The first confirmed killing connected to Patrick David Mackay did not begin with a dramatic confrontation witnessed by strangers. There was no crowded street, no immediate alarm raised by a passerby, no warning that something terrible was about to happen. Like many violent crimes that occur behind closed doors, it unfolded in a place where people expected privacy and safety. The home. A place built around familiarity. A place where routines repeat so often that they become almost invisible. For the elderly residents of London during the 1970s, home was often the one environment where the outside world could be kept at a comfortable distance. The noise of traffic disappeared behind closed windows. The worries of politics and economic uncertainty felt far away. Within those walls existed decades of personal history. For Isabella Griffiths, that home represented an entire lifetime. By February 1974, she was 84 years old. She had lived through a century marked by enormous transformation. The world of her childhood would have been almost unrecognizable compared with the London surrounding her in the 1970s. Technology had advanced. Society had changed. Generations had come and gone. Yet her daily life remained grounded in familiar habits. There is a particular quietness to the lives of many elderly people living alone. The outside world moves quickly, but their own rhythm becomes slower and more deliberate. Days are measured not by deadlines but by routines. The morning newspaper arrives. Tea is prepared. Household tasks are completed carefully. Familiar objects remain in familiar places. The absence of sudden change can become a form of comfort. And that comfort can create a sense of safety. On the day Isabella died, there was no public indication that danger was approaching. No one watching the street would have seen anything unusual. There was no obvious sign that an ordinary day was about to become part of a criminal investigation that would eventually attract national attention. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of cases like this. The moments before tragedy often look exactly like every other ordinary moment. A person opens a door. A conversation begins. A familiar routine continues. Nothing announces that the final chapter of someone's life has arrived. According to the investigation that followed, Mackay entered Isabella Griffith's home and attacked her. Authorities later determined that she had been killed by strangulation and stabbing. The violence ended a life that had lasted more than 8 decades. But for investigators, the physical details of the crime represented only one part of the tragedy. The deeper question was how a young man in his early 20s had crossed the boundary from criminal behavior into lethal violence. For many offenders, there is a recognizable escalation. Minor crimes become more serious. Anger becomes harder to control. Risk-taking increases. Boundaries that once existed begin disappearing. In Mackay's case, investigators later examined his history and found years of troubling behavior before this moment. Yet understanding a pattern after a crime has occurred is very different from preventing it before the crime happens. That difference would become central to debates surrounding the case. The death of Isabella Griffiths was not immediately understood as the beginning of a wider pattern. At that stage, there was no public knowledge of a serial offender moving through London. There was only a single elderly woman whose life had ended violently. For those closest to Isabella, the aftermath was not about criminal theories. It was about absence. The empty space left behind. The sudden realization that someone who had been part of their world would never again answer the telephone, open the curtains in the morning, or share another ordinary conversation. Investigators entered a very different world. A crime scene is not simply a location where evidence exists. It is a place where a person's final moments must be reconstructed from fragments. Objects become clues. Positions become questions. Small details gain importance. A room that once represented private life becomes transformed into a place of examination. Detectives must separate emotion from procedure. They must observe carefully. They must record accurately. They must resist assumptions. Every investigation begins with uncertainty. Who entered the home? Why was this person targeted? Was the victim known to the offender? Was there a connection? Was this an isolated event or part of something larger? At the time of Isabella's death, investigators did not yet have answers. What they had was a victim, a crime scene, and the responsibility of finding the truth. The case might have remained one tragic homicide among many others if not for later events that gradually connected Mackay to additional offenses. The significance of Isabella's death would grow only after investigators discovered a much larger picture. Months later, another elderly woman would become connected to Mackay. Another home would become the center of an investigation. Another family would experience the same devastating transition from ordinary life to unimaginable loss. The similarities would begin to emerge. Elderly victims. Private residences. A pattern involving trust and vulnerability. The possibility that these were not random acts but the work of one individual. For detectives, patterns are often the difference between separate cases and a single investigation. A single crime may provide limited information. Multiple crimes create comparisons. Methods can be examined. Timelines can be reconstructed. Behaviors can be analyzed. But patterns are rarely visible at the beginning. They appear only after someone has the courage and patience to connect separate pieces together. In early 1974, no one yet knew that Isabella Griffith's death would become one of those pieces. Her name would later appear alongside others. Her story would become part of a much larger investigation. But she was not the beginning of a criminal timeline. She was a person. A woman who had lived 84 years before violence interrupted the final chapter of her life. That fact matters because the danger of true crime storytelling is that victims can disappear beneath the shadow of the offender. The person responsible becomes the center of attention, while the people harmed become footnotes. But Isabella Griffiths was never a footnote. She was someone who had experienced nearly an entire century of human history. Someone whose life existed long before Patrick Mackay entered it. Someone whose final days should not be remembered only because of how they ended. The investigation that followed would eventually reveal more about the person responsible. It would uncover connections. It would expose a disturbing pattern. It would lead detectives closer to Patrick Mackay. But before any of that happened, There was only one undeniable truth. An elderly woman who had spent 84 years building a life was gone. And somewhere in London, a young man who had already troubled authorities for years had taken another step into a world from which there would be no return. The death of Isabella Griffiths would later become recognized as one of the earliest confirmed crimes linked to Patrick Mackay. But at the time, it existed only as a single devastating event. Investigators did not yet know they were looking at the beginning of a chain of violence. They did not know that the person responsible would later become one of the most controversial figures in Britain's criminal history. A murder investigation begins with questions. Not conclusions. Not certainty. Questions. Who was the victim? Who had access to her? Who had a reason to harm her? Was this an act of opportunity or something planned? Was the offender someone known to her, or a stranger who had crossed her path? In the first hours and days after Isabella Griffiths was found, detectives had to work through those uncertainties carefully. They were faced with a reality familiar to investigators everywhere. The victim's world had suddenly become the starting point of a search for answers. The people who knew Isabella best could provide something no forensic examination could ever reveal. They could describe who she was. They could explain her routines. They could identify the things that mattered to her. They could transform a crime scene back into a home where a person had lived. For investigators, this process is essential. Before understanding the actions of an offender, they must understand the life that was taken. A victim's habits can reveal unusual circumstances. A missing object can suggest motive. A conversation remembered by a neighbor can become a crucial detail. Every small piece matters. In Isabella's case, the circumstances surrounding her death reflected one of the most difficult realities faced by investigators handling crimes against elderly people. Many elderly residents living alone have fewer daily interactions than younger people. A person can remain unseen for longer periods. A missed appointment may not immediately trigger concern. A quiet home may appear normal from the outside. The same independence that many elderly people value can sometimes make them more vulnerable. Not because they are unaware. Not because they are careless. But because fewer people may notice immediately when something is wrong. This created challenges for police officers trying to establish timelines. The hours before a victim's death are often the most important part of an investigation. Detectives want to know who was present, who was nearby, and what unusual events occurred. But when someone lives privately, those final hours can become difficult to reconstruct. A stranger can enter and leave without attracting attention. A conversation can happen behind closed doors. A neighbor may remember seeing someone unusual but only realize its importance later. This would become a recurring theme as investigators examined the crimes associated with Patrick Mackay. The offender did not rely on dramatic methods that would immediately attract attention. Instead, the circumstances involved ordinary environments and ordinary interactions. That made the investigation more complex because the very normality of the surroundings became part of the challenge. There was no obvious public threat. No warning that communities could easily recognize. The danger existed within moments that appeared harmless. This is one reason the case had such a lasting psychological impact. It challenged a deeply held assumption that danger is easy to identify. Often, it is not. A person can appear calm while carrying harmful intentions. A familiar setting can conceal a terrible event. A normal conversation can have consequences that no one expects. After Isabella's death, the investigation continued quietly. Detectives gathered information, interviewed people connected to her life, and attempted to understand what had happened inside her home. At this stage, there was no public panic. There was no widespread awareness of a possible pattern. There was simply a community grieving and police officers searching for answers. Then, more than a year later, another elderly woman would become part of the story. Her name was Adele Price. The circumstances surrounding her death would bring investigators closer to recognizing a connection. Like Isabella, Adele was elderly and living alone. Like Isabella, She represented a generation accustomed to trusting social interactions that had long been part of everyday life. And like Isabella, she became connected to Patrick Mackay through circumstances that would later reveal a disturbing pattern. The similarities between the two cases became increasingly difficult to ignore. Investigators began seeing connections that had not been visible before. The possibility emerged that these were not separate tragedies. They might have been chapters of the same story. For police officers, this realization changes the entire nature of an investigation. A single homicide requires finding an offender. Multiple connected homicides require understanding a pattern. The questions become broader. Why these victims? Why these locations? Why this method? What behavior links each event? Patterns reveal themselves slowly. They are built from details that initially seem insignificant. A location. A witness statement. A recovered item. A familiar approach used more than once. The work requires patience because investigators must avoid two opposite mistakes. They must not ignore connections. But they must also avoid forcing unrelated events into a pattern simply because they want answers. In high-profile investigations, pressure can become intense. The public wants certainty. Families want justice. Media attention increases. Every decision is examined. Detectives must continue following evidence rather than emotion. The case surrounding Patrick Mackay would eventually become a lesson in exactly how important that discipline is. His crimes created a complex mixture of confirmed facts and unresolved claims. Some events could be proven through evidence. Others remained connected mainly through his own statements. Separating truth from speculation became one of the greatest challenges surrounding the investigation. But before those questions reached the courtroom, investigators first had to establish the link between Mackay and the crimes they could prove. The turning point would come after the death of Father Anthony Crean. That case would transform Patrick Mackay from a suspected offender into the central figure of a national investigation. The killing of the priest shocked investigators not only because of its brutality but because of the relationship between victim and offender. Mackay was not simply connected to a random stranger. There had been previous contact. There had been an attempt to help him. The crime represented a betrayal that deeply affected those who learned about it. A person who had offered assistance became a victim. A relationship built around compassion ended in violence. And for police, the case provided something they had not previously possessed. A path leading directly toward Patrick Mackay. The investigation that began with unanswered questions surrounding Isabella Griffiths was now moving toward a suspect. The separate pieces were beginning to form a larger picture. But the full extent of that picture had not yet been revealed. Because when investigators began examining Mackay's background, they discovered that the story did not begin with Father Crean. It did not begin with Adele Price. It did not even begin with Isabella Griffiths. The roots of the case stretched much further back, into a childhood marked by warning signs, institutional intervention, and repeated concerns about a young man whose behavior had troubled people long before his name became known across Britain. And as those details emerged, the investigation became about more than solving individual murders. It became about understanding how a person with such a documented history of violence had reached the point where irreversible harm was finally done. The final days before Patrick Mackay's arrest were marked by a growing sense that something terrible had happened, even before investigators fully understood what they were dealing with. A single violent act had become the doorway into a much larger investigation. The death of Father Anthony Crean would not remain an isolated tragedy. It would become the moment when scattered pieces of information began to converge. For detectives, the case changed direction. The question was no longer simply, who killed Father Crean? It became, was this connected to something more? The answer would lead them into one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Britain during the 1970s. Father Anthony Crean had lived a life centered around helping others. As a priest, he was accustomed to encountering people during moments of difficulty. His role placed him in contact with individuals who were struggling financially, emotionally, or personally. Offering assistance was not an unusual decision for him. It was part of his daily responsibility. That willingness to help was one of the details that made his death especially difficult for those who knew him. According to historical accounts, Mackay had previously received help from Father Crean. The exact nature of their interactions became an important part of the investigation, because it showed that the two men were not complete strangers. There had been a connection before violence entered the story. For investigators, relationships matter. A victim's connection to a suspect can reveal motive. A previous interaction can explain opportunity. A seemingly ordinary meeting can become a crucial moment in a timeline. In many homicide investigations, the most important question is not simply where a crime occurred, but why that particular victim was chosen. The relationship between Patrick Mackay and Father Crean provided investigators with a possible explanation. Trust had been established. Access had been gained. A person who had attempted to provide assistance had unknowingly allowed someone dangerous closer to him. The tragedy was not only the loss of a respected member of the community. It was the realization that compassion itself had been exploited. When news of Father Crean's death spread, the reaction extended beyond those who knew him personally. A priest often occupies a unique place within a community. He is not simply a religious figure performing ceremonies. He becomes part of people's personal histories. He baptizes children. He comforts families during grief. He stands beside people during important moments of their lives. The death of such a person creates a sense of collective loss. But for investigators, emotion had to be separated from evidence. Their task was to establish facts. They needed to determine what happened, when it happened, and who was responsible. The crime scene provided important information. Physical evidence began creating a timeline. Witness accounts helped reconstruct movements. Connections between Mackay and the victim became increasingly significant. And then came the evidence that would change everything. During the investigation, police discovered links between Mackay and previous offenses. Among the crucial discoveries was forensic evidence connecting him to the earlier death of Adele Price. Fingerprint evidence became a major turning point, demonstrating how advances in forensic investigation could transform a case. A detail that might once have been overlooked could now provide a direct connection. A trace left behind could speak when witnesses could not. For detectives, this was the breakthrough they needed. The investigation was no longer built entirely around suspicion. It now had evidence. The arrest of Patrick Mackay brought immediate attention to the question that would define the rest of the case. How many victims were there? As police examined his background, they encountered a disturbing mixture of confirmed crimes, accusations, and confessions. Mackay began making statements about additional killings beyond those already linked to him. Some of these claims contained details that appeared to correspond with missing persons or unresolved cases. Others could not be independently verified. This created a challenge that would continue for decades. A confession is powerful. But a confession alone does not always equal proof. Investigators must examine whether details can be confirmed through physical evidence, witness testimony, or other reliable information. Without independent verification, even shocking admissions must be treated carefully. The public, however, often reacts differently. The possibility that a convicted killer may have committed many more crimes creates a natural desire for answers. Each unresolved disappearance becomes a question. Each unsolved homicide becomes a possibility. Was there another victim? Was there another family still waiting for answers? Was there another case file that could finally be closed? These questions followed Mackay throughout the investigation and beyond. But before those mysteries could be examined, investigators had to focus on the crimes they could prove. The deaths of Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean formed the core of the prosecution case. 3 lives. 3 families affected. 3 communities changed forever. Yet even within those confirmed cases, the investigation revealed a broader story about vulnerability, trust, and missed opportunities. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Mackay case was that the crimes did not occur in environments associated with obvious danger. They occurred within homes and communities where people believed they were safe. That reality changed how many people viewed strangers. It changed how communities thought about protection. It changed how investigators examined offenders who appeared ordinary. Because the greatest challenge posed by individuals like Mackay is not simply their capacity for violence. It is their ability to exist among others without immediately revealing that danger. A person can walk through crowded streets unnoticed. A person can speak politely. A person can appear calm. And yet, beneath that surface, there may exist a history that others cannot see. The investigation into Patrick Mackay forced Britain to confront that uncomfortable reality. It raised questions about whether warning signs from his childhood had been taken seriously enough. It raised questions about whether institutions had the resources and authority necessary to manage someone considered dangerous. It raised questions about where responsibility lies when multiple systems encounter the same troubled individual over many years. But before those questions reached public debate, there was a more immediate matter. Justice for the victims. For the families of Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean, the investigation was not an academic discussion about criminology or psychology. It was personal. It was about knowing who had taken away someone they loved. It was about seeing accountability established. It was about making sure that the lives of their family members were not forgotten beneath the attention surrounding the offender. The arrest of Patrick Mackay brought a measure of certainty. But certainty does not erase pain. A conviction cannot restore decades of memories. It cannot return conversations that will never happen. It cannot fill empty spaces at family gatherings. It can only acknowledge responsibility for what occurred. And as detectives prepared their case, they understood that they were not simply presenting evidence against one man. They were presenting the stories of 3 people whose lives had been interrupted. The courtroom would later examine facts, testimony, and legal arguments. But behind every piece of evidence was a human story. Behind every photograph was a person. Behind every date was a life that once continued beyond it. The investigation had finally found its suspect. The next challenge would be proving exactly what he had done and determining how the justice system should respond to a man whose history suggested that the violence began long before the crimes that brought him to court. A criminal investigation rarely begins with certainty. It begins with fragments. A detail that feels insignificant at first. A memory that seems incomplete. An object left behind. A statement from someone who does not yet understand the importance of what they have witnessed. The truth of a crime is rarely found in a single moment. It is constructed slowly, piece by piece, as investigators separate what is known from what is assumed. In the case of Patrick David Mackay, the path toward the truth began with 3 separate tragedies. At first, they appeared to exist independently of one another. 3 victims. 3 locations. 3 investigations that had their own questions and their own uncertainties. Only later would detectives realize they were looking at different chapters of the same story. The first challenge was understanding the victim's final moments. A home after a violent crime is unlike any other place an investigator enters. It is simultaneously a personal space and a source of evidence. Every object has 2 meanings. Before the crime, it belonged to someone's ordinary life. After the crime, it becomes part of a search for answers. A chair is no longer simply a chair. A doorway is no longer simply an entrance. A personal belonging is no longer simply an object. Everything must be examined. Everything must be recorded. Everything must be understood. For detectives investigating the death of Isabella Griffiths, the focus was initially on establishing what had happened inside her home. They needed to determine whether her death was connected to someone she knew or whether she had become the victim of a stranger. This distinction is one of the earliest and most important questions in homicide investigations. Many murders are committed by someone within the victim's circle. A relative. An acquaintance. A person with a personal grievance. A relationship often provides the explanation investigators need. But crimes involving strangers create a different challenge. There is no obvious connection. No immediate motive. No clear path from victim to offender. The investigation must expand outward. Every person who had contact with the victim becomes important. Every unusual event becomes worth examining. Every possibility must remain open. In Isabella Griffith's case, investigators would eventually identify Patrick Mackay as the person responsible. But at the time, that conclusion was far from obvious. The idea that an elderly person could be targeted by someone who appeared to have no personal connection to them created a difficult investigative problem. Without a known relationship, detectives had fewer immediate leads. They had to rely on evidence, timelines, and careful reconstruction. This is where forensic investigation becomes essential. A fingerprint. A trace of material. A recovered possession. A witness who remembers something unusual. Each piece can appear small, but together they can create a picture. The importance of forensic evidence became even clearer in the investigation of Adele Price's death. Like Isabella, Adele was an elderly woman living alone. The similarities between the circumstances surrounding the two deaths gradually attracted attention. Investigators began considering whether the cases might be connected. But suspicion is not proof. A pattern may suggest a possibility, but evidence must establish a connection. Detectives needed something that could link a person to both crimes. That link would eventually come through fingerprints. Fingerprint identification had already become an important tool in criminal investigations by the 1970s. Unlike witness descriptions, which can be affected by stress, memory, or limited observation, fingerprints provide a unique physical connection between a person and a location. They do not explain motive. They do not reveal intention. But they can answer a fundamental question. Was this person there? In the investigation surrounding Patrick Mackay, fingerprint evidence became one of the critical factors connecting him to the crimes. A mark left behind at a scene became a silent witness. It did not speak. It did not accuse. It simply provided information. And that information changed the direction of the investigation. Before forensic evidence connected Mackay to the crimes, he was not yet the central figure in a national investigation. He was a person with a troubled history, but history alone was not enough to secure a conviction. The justice system requires proof. Not reputation. Not fear. Not assumptions. Evidence. This principle is especially important in cases involving individuals who have previous records or troubling backgrounds. A person's past may raise concern, but every criminal charge must be supported by evidence related to the specific offense being investigated. For detectives, the discovery of physical evidence created a bridge between past suspicion and present proof. The investigation expanded. Mackay's movements were examined. His relationships were reviewed. His possessions were searched. Investigators began looking for connections that might reveal the full extent of his activities. What they found was deeply disturbing. During searches connected to the investigation, police discovered items that appeared to belong to victims. These discoveries strengthened the case against him and suggested that the crimes were not isolated incidents. The investigation was becoming a reconstruction of a pattern. But patterns are complicated. They can reveal truth. They can also create assumptions. Detectives had to carefully separate what could be demonstrated from what could only be suspected. This distinction would become one of the defining features of the Patrick Mackay case. After his arrest, Mackay made claims about additional killings. Some statements contained details that investigators found significant. Some appeared to correspond with unresolved cases. Others lacked enough independent evidence to move beyond suspicion. For the families of missing people, such statements created a painful mixture of hope and uncertainty. A confession can reopen old wounds. It can suggest that answers may finally be possible. But when evidence does not confirm those claims, uncertainty remains. For investigators, the process required patience. Every claim had to be examined. Every detail had to be tested. Every possible connection had to be measured against available evidence. The public often imagines investigations as moments of sudden revelation, a detective discovering the one clue that solves everything. Real investigations are usually different. They are built through thousands of small decisions. A conversation repeated several times. A document reviewed carefully. A piece of evidence compared with existing records. A detail that seemed insignificant until placed beside another. The Patrick Mackay investigation followed that same process. The discovery of the connection between crimes was not the result of one dramatic moment. It was the result of investigators slowly assembling a picture that had previously been hidden. And at the center of that picture was a disturbing realization. The deaths of Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean were not separate tragedies. They were connected by one individual. A man whose name would soon become known throughout Britain. A man whose own words would create even more questions. A man whose history would force investigators to look backward not only at the crimes themselves, but at the years of behavior that came before them. Because finding Patrick Mackay was only the beginning. The next challenge was understanding him. Understanding how someone with such a long record of concerning behavior had reached this point. Understanding whether the known crimes represented the full extent of his actions. And understanding what justice could mean when the truth was both partially revealed and permanently incomplete. When investigators began connecting the deaths associated with Patrick Mackay, they were not simply following a trail of physical evidence. They were attempting to reconstruct a hidden sequence of events that had unfolded quietly, often behind closed doors, without witnesses who understood what they had seen. The difficulty of the investigation came from the nature of the crimes themselves. There was no single dramatic confrontation in a public place. No crowd of witnesses watching every movement. No immediate explanation written clearly at the scene. Instead, detectives were forced to work backward. They had to start with the aftermath and carefully rebuild the moments that came before. This is one of the most challenging aspects of homicide investigation. The victim's final moments cannot be observed directly. They must be reconstructed through evidence. Investigators examine physical surroundings, forensic findings, witness accounts, and behavioral patterns to create the most accurate possible timeline. Every conclusion must be earned. Every assumption must be questioned. The investigation into Patrick Mackay became a process of turning uncertainty into facts. After the death of Father Anthony Crean, the direction of the investigation changed dramatically. The circumstances surrounding the priest's death brought Mackay directly into focus. But identifying a suspect and proving a suspect's responsibility are two very different stages of criminal investigation. Police needed to establish connections. They needed to understand Mackay's movements. They needed to determine whether the evidence supported a wider pattern. And they needed to examine his background, not as proof of guilt by itself, but as context for understanding the person they were investigating. When officers looked deeper into Mackay's life, they discovered a history already marked by violence, criminal behavior, and repeated contact with authorities. This background did not automatically prove responsibility for every crime under investigation, but it helped explain why detectives considered him a serious